Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past comes alive with the power to explain our world today. In this journey, we dive deep into one of the most dramatic, electrifying, and revealing chapters in American history. The Gilded Age, a period that glittered with wealth, innovation, and ambition, yet was shadowed by corruption, inequality, and relentless struggle. In the next 2 hours, you'll explore the rise of industrial titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt, men who transformed steel, oil, and railroads into empires that redefined capitalism. You'll walk through booming cities and overcrowded tenements, witness the battles between workers and corporations, and follow immigrants as they carve out new lives in a rapidly changing nation. You'll see political machines rise and fall, scientific discoveries reshape medicine, and social movements fight for justice in the face of overwhelming odds. This is not just a story of the past. It's a mirror reflecting the world we live in now. A world of billionaire power, technological revolutions, culture wars, and the eternal struggle between democracy and inequality. So settle in, open your mind, and let the history unfold. By the time we reach the end, you'll understand not just what America once was, but why it still feels like we're living in a second Gilded Age today. This is the complete story. This is the deeper truth behind the shine. This is History Teller YT. The American Gilded Age, stretching roughly from the 1870s to 1900, emerged from a convergence of industrial ambition, political realignment, and economic transformation that reshaped the United States more dramatically than any era since the Civil War. It was a time when railways stitched the vast nation together, when coal and steel powered the engines of urban growth, and when visionary, or predatory, depending on perspective, industrial magnates rose to dominate entire sectors of the economy. This segment focuses on the foundational forces that set the stage for this sweeping shift. The explosive growth of industries, the consolidation of capital, and the shifting balance between labor, markets, and government. These foundations matter because they formed an environment in which inequality could grow to unprecedented levels, while the promise of opportunity remained enticing enough to draw millions into America's expanding cities. Industries did not expand in isolation. They were fueled by immigration, mechanization, and the increasing willingness of investors to tolerate risk in pursuit of extraordinary returns. That culture of risk and ambition separated the Gilded Age from earlier periods of American development. Before the Civil War, the U.S. industrial economy existed, but lacked the scale and intensity that the later decades would introduce. After the war, entrepreneurs and financiers saw opportunities everywhere. In railways that needed to be extended, in oil fields that could be tapped, in cities that needed infrastructure, and in technologies that could be scaled far beyond anything previously imagined. These forces, swirling together, created the intense dynamism that made the Gilded Age both extraordinary and destabilizing, planting the seeds of modern American capitalism. One of the most powerful accelerators of the Gilded Age's rise was the rapid advancement of industrial technology. Steam engines became more efficient and were deployed across factories, railroads, and shipping operations. The Bessemer process revolutionized steel production, enabling manufacturers like Andrew Carnegie to produce steel faster, cheaper, and with fewer impurities than earlier methods allowed. This steel formed the backbone of skyscrapers, bridges, railroads, and machinery, effectively setting the architectural and transportation template for the modern United States. In addition to steel, the expansion of telegraph lines and the later introduction of telephones facilitated communication at a speed unimaginable to previous generations. Business leaders could now coordinate shipping, negotiate deals, and track inventory across the country in hours rather than weeks. These technological advances didn't just make production more efficient. They also reshaped organizational structures, encouraging large-scale corporations with centralized management. The factory system grew more complex and hierarchical, requiring layers of administrators, foremen, and workers. Yet with progress came tension. Machines displaced skilled laborers, and industrial work became more repetitive, dangerous, and dehumanizing. This set the stage for labor unrest and strikes that would become a hallmark of the Gilded Age. Meanwhile, investors poured capital into promising ventures, sometimes fueling speculative bubbles that mirrored patterns we still observe in modern economies. Technology, capital, and ambition became tightly intertwined, producing both unprecedented wealth and deep social strains. Alongside industrial growth, the United States underwent a profound demographic shift during the Gilded Age. Immigrants from Europe, especially Ireland, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Eastern Europe, arrived by the millions, seeking better wages, political freedoms, or simply escape from famine and persecution. At the same time, African Americans continued to migrate out of the Reconstruction South toward northern cities, even though the Great Migration in its full form would come later. This influx of people transformed urban centers like New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Boston into bustling, overcrowded, culturally diverse hubs. However, the opportunities these cities promised often clashed with harsh realities: tenement housing, unsafe working conditions, pollution, and political corruption. The massive workforce allowed industrialists to expand their factories rapidly while maintaining low labor costs, reinforcing a system in which the gains of growth flowed unevenly toward owners and investors rather than workers. Meanwhile, political machines like New York's Tammany Hall thrived in this environment by exchanging social services for votes, blurring the lines between governance and organized corruption. Urban infrastructure struggled to keep up with population surges, leading to inadequate sanitation, disease outbreaks, and chronic housing shortages. Yet even amid these challenges, cities acted as engines of cultural dynamism, bringing together people with different languages, customs, and skills. This demographic turbulence is essential to understanding the Gilded Age, because it created both the human foundation of industrial growth and the inequalities that defined the era, a pattern that strongly mirrors today's globalized, urbanized, technologically accelerating world. The ascent of America's most iconic industrial titans during the Gilded Age did not happen merely through luck or timing. It emerged from a unique combination of technological opportunity, aggressive business strategy, and a political environment that largely refrained from regulating corporate behavior. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and other powerful figures built business empires that reshaped every corner of the American economy. Their rise demonstrated how personal ambition could converge with national needs. The country needed steel, oil, railroads, banks, and mechanisms to organize capital on a previously unimaginable scale. Carnegie harnessed the Bessemer process to dominate steel. Rockefeller used a blend of efficiency, vertical integration, and ruthless elimination of competitors to control the oil industry. Vanderbilt built transportation networks that knit together entire regions. These men were not merely participating in industries, they were reinventing them. Their operations became laboratories of modern corporate management, demanding new systems of accounting, planning, and labor coordination. By concentrating resources and decision-making, they could innovate faster, negotiate harder, and expand more aggressively. Yet their dominance raised troubling questions about the nature of power in a democracy. As their fortunes soared, Many Americans wondered whether the United States was drifting toward a new aristocracy, one built not on hereditary titles, but on monopolistic control. Their companies influenced politics, shaped legislation, and set prices in ways that left smaller competitors gasping for survival. The rise of these titans thus formed the core tension of the Gilded Age, the dazzling potential of industrial growth versus the unsettling reality of unchecked corporate power. No figure symbolizes the complex duality of the Gilded Age more than John D. Rockefeller. Through Standard Oil, he created perhaps the most efficient industrial organism of the 19th century, deploying strategies that would become textbook examples of market domination. Rockefeller believed that chaos and competition wasted resources, so he sought relentless consolidation. He used secret railroad rebates to undercut rivals, purchased competitors during downturns, and imposed rigorous cost control systems across every branch of his empire. The result was a company that refined oil more cheaply, distributed it more effectively, and scaled operations more rapidly than any rival could match. But this efficiency came at a social cost. Standard Oil gained control of nearly 90% of the nation's refining capacity, alarming the public and prompting debates about monopoly power. Newspapers railed against Rockefeller's methods, labeling him a symbol of corporate greed. Yet, paradoxically, his company delivered lower prices and more reliable products to consumers, complicating the moral narrative. Carnegie's story reveals similar contradictions. His embrace of vertical integration, controlling mines, railroads, mills, and transportation, allowed the Carnegie Steel Company to produce immense quantities of steel at unmatched prices. Carnegie publicly championed the gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich had a moral obligation to donate much of their fortune to society. Privately, however, he presided over harsh working conditions and broke strikes with military force, most notoriously during the 1892 Homestead Strike. These paradoxes highlight the defining theme of the era: extraordinary public benefit emerging from deeply controversial private power. The Titans produced the steel, fuel, and infrastructure that modernized America, but they did so through methods that strained the social fabric and raised profound ethical dilemmas. As the industrial barons expanded their wealth and influence, the financial world underwent a dramatic transformation that further entrenched their power. J.P. Morgan, the era's most powerful banker, played a pivotal role in shaping American capitalism by providing stability in a chaotic and rapidly expanding economy. Where Carnegie and Rockefeller controlled industries, Morgan controlled capital itself. He orchestrated mergers, stabilized failing companies, and created holding structures that could manage massive corporate entities. His purchase of Carnegie Steel in 1901 led to the creation of U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Morgan's influence extended beyond business. During financial panics, particularly the Panic of 1893 and the Panic of 1907, he acted as an unofficial central bank, coordinating bailouts and reorganizing the nation's financial institutions to prevent economic collapse. This role demonstrated the emerging reality of the Gilded Age. Private financiers often wielded more immediate power over national stability than elected officials. While many credited Morgan with preventing deeper crises, others criticized the concentration of financial authority in the hands of a single individual. These concerns fed growing public unease about trusts and monopolies. Newspapers, muckraking journalists, and populist politicians warned that the United States was becoming a nation controlled not by its citizens, but by a handful of corporate giants. Yet, simultaneously, these same giants funded universities, libraries, museums, and scientific research, laying cultural foundations that endure today. Thus, the financial evolution of the Gilded Age illustrated a profound contradiction. A nation that thrived on innovation, efficiency, and wealth creation, but remained deeply troubled by the social and political imbalances that accompanied such dramatic concentrations of power. The late 19th century marked one of the most dramatic urban transformations in American history. Before the Civil War, most Americans lived in rural areas, working on farms or in small towns where life moved at a slower, more predictable pace. But by the 1870s, waves of industrialization were pulling millions towards cities that promised employment, opportunity, and a new sense of modern life. Cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Boston, and Baltimore expanded at astonishing rates, growing upward with steel-framed skyscrapers and outward with new transit lines and electric streetcars. The sheer pace of change overwhelmed traditional institutions, forcing city governments, religious organizations, charities, and communities to develop new systems of support, control, and adaptation. Immigrants from Europe and migrants from rural America arrived faster than cities could absorb them, creating a dynamic but often chaotic environment where innovation and desperation coexisted. Urban life offered access to theaters, newspapers, libraries, department stores, and cultural experimentation, but also exposed people to unprecedented forms of inequality, pollution, crime, and overcrowding. These contradictions became the essence of Gilded Age cities, places of both extraordinary potential and brutal struggle. The new urban skyline, dominated by factories, mills, tenements, and rail yards, reflected the industrial priorities of the era. Smoke from coal-fired plants constantly hung over streets, darkening the sky and coating buildings in soot. The overall environment was both energizing and oppressive, capturing the restless spirit of a society rapidly reinventing itself. Cities became magnets of ambition, creativity, and hardship, setting the stage for many of the political, social, and cultural battles that would define the Gilded Age. Life in Gilded Age cities was profoundly shaped by the housing crisis that accompanied rapid population growth. Tenements, narrow, cheaply built apartment buildings packed into urban blocks, became the default housing for millions of immigrants and poor workers. These buildings often lacked adequate plumbing, ventilation, and natural light. Entire families lived in single rooms, sometimes sharing space with boarders to cover rent. Children slept on the floor, and many apartments were used simultaneously as factories in the burgeoning sweatshop economy. The lack of sanitation led to frequent outbreaks of cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid, and other deadly diseases. Reformers like Jacob Riis documented these conditions through journalism and early photography, exposing to middle-class readers the grim realities of urban poverty. His work helped inspire new building regulations and public health measures, but progress came slowly. Meanwhile, wealthier residents moved into more spacious neighborhoods or fled to newly developing suburbs, made accessible by streetcars and railways. This created a stark spatial inequality within cities, with the wealthy living in relative comfort, while the poor endured hardship only blocks away. The contrast was especially visible in places like New York's Fifth Avenue, where luxurious mansions rose within walking distance of overcrowded immigrant districts. Even though tenement life was brutal, it also became a site of cultural resilience and community building. Ethnic enclaves formed, where newcomers could speak their native languages, practice familiar customs, and find support networks. These communities created their own newspapers, schools, theaters, religious institutions, and mutual aid societies. As a result, Despite the hardships, the urban immigrant experience helped shape a new, diverse American identity. The story of tenements is thus not only one of suffering, but also of adaptation, creativity, and the roots of modern multicultural urban life. One of the most transformative forces shaping Gilded Age cities was the rapid development of urban infrastructure. Water systems, sewer networks, electric grids, streetcar lines, and public transportation became essential to maintaining the vast populations now filling American urban centers. Before these innovations, cities struggled with rampant fires, contaminated water supplies, and virtually non-existent waste management. But the pressure of urban growth forced technological and administrative breakthroughs. Engineers developed new sewage systems designed to reduce disease, while public health officials began advocating for clean water supplies drawn from distant reservoirs. Street lighting transitioned from gas lamps to electric bulbs, dramatically improving safety and extending nightlife. Department stores emerged as symbols of consumer culture, using electricity to illuminate dazzling interiors that encouraged browsing and impulse buying. Public transportation fundamentally reshaped city geography. Horse-drawn streetcars were replaced by electric trolleys in the 1880s and 1890s, allowing cities to expand far beyond their traditional boundaries and enabling workers to live farther from factories. This shift paved the way for early suburbs and laid the foundation for the modern American metropolitan landscape. Yet infrastructure improvements also mirrored the inequalities of the era. Wealthier districts received upgrades sooner and more consistently, while poorer neighborhoods often endured outdated, unsafe, or neglected services. Corruption within city governments, particularly those run by powerful political machines, frequently determined where resources flowed. Despite these challenges, infrastructure innovations helped modernize the urban environment, setting patterns still visible today. Dense business centers, sprawling residential districts, and the essential but often overlooked backbone of utilities, transit, and public works. These developments made cities engines of economic growth and cultural exchange, but they also magnified social divides, illustrating how technological progress can both uplift and marginalize communities depending on how power is allocated. The Gilded Age was not only an era of unprecedented economic growth and towering industrial fortunes, it was also a time of intense conflict between labor and capital. As factories expanded and corporations consolidated power, workers found themselves trapped in demanding, often dangerous environments with little legal protection. 12-hour workdays, 6-day work weeks, and relentless production demands became standard across steel mills, coal mines, textile factories, and railroads. Industrial accidents were widespread and frequently fatal, as machinery lacked safety guards and employers seldom invested in worker protections. Children as young as 8 or 9 years old were commonly found in factories or mines, performing hazardous tasks for wages far below those of adults. Women, too, formed a crucial part of the labor force, but received significantly lower pay and faced constant exploitation and harassment. Against this backdrop of harsh conditions, a new working-class consciousness began to form. Workers increasingly recognized that individual complaints were powerless against corporations capable of hiring replacement labor, exploiting immigrant desperation, or calling in private security forces to suppress dissent. This realization sparked the growth of labor unions, which sought to organize workers across industries, negotiate better conditions, and challenge the unchecked authority of industrial barons. The struggle was not merely economic. It was also moral and political, touching on broader questions about democracy, citizenship, and the responsibilities of employers to their employees. As tensions mounted, strikes became more frequent and more fiercely contested, setting the stage for explosive confrontations that would define labor relations for decades to come. These conflicts exposed the deep contradictions of the Gilded Age. While the nation celebrated technological progress and entrepreneurial success, millions of workers were forced to fight simply for dignity, safety, and the basic right to shape the conditions of their own labor. One of the earliest and most significant episodes of labor unrest during the Gilded Age was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This strike erupted in response to wage cuts imposed by major railroad companies struggling after the Panic of 1873. Workers in West Virginia, angered by the latest in a series of pay reductions, walked off the job, blocking trains and refusing to allow freight to move. The strike rapidly spread to major cities including Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Chicago, and St. Louis, drawing in tens of thousands of workers from multiple industries who sympathized with the railroad employees' plight. What made the strike particularly shocking to the American public was its scale and intensity. Trains were stalled along major routes, rail yards were seized, and violent clashes broke out as state militias attempted to break up crowds. In Pittsburgh, militias fired on strikers, killing dozens, which triggered riots that destroyed miles of track and millions of dollars in property. The federal government ultimately deployed soldiers to suppress the strike, marking one of the first major instances when federal force was used to settle a labor dispute. Although the strike ended in defeat for the workers, it dramatically changed the national conversation about labor rights. The violence and unrest revealed the extent of worker frustration and forced the public to confront the social costs of unregulated industrial capitalism. The strike also inspired the formation of new labor organizations, including the Knights of Labor, which sought to unite workers across trades and ethnicities into a broad-based coalition. While the Knights would eventually decline, their vision of solidarity left an enduring legacy. The Great Railroad Strike demonstrated that labor conflict had become a powerful force, one that could shut down transportation networks, disrupt commerce, and challenge the authority of employers and government alike. It also foreshadowed the even larger labor wars that would emerge later in the century, making 1877 a turning point in the struggle between labor and capital. The later decades of the Gilded Age saw even more explosive confrontations between labor and capital, culminating in events like the Haymarket Affair of 1886, the Homestead Strike of 1892, and the Pullman Strike of 1894. These conflicts not only shaped public perceptions of unions, but also influenced national policy and the trajectory of the labor movement. The Haymarket Affair began as a peaceful demonstration in Chicago advocating for the 8-hour workday. When police attempted to disperse the crowd, an unidentified assailant threw a bomb, killing several officers. The incident triggered nationwide hysteria, fueling anti-labor sentiment and resulting in a highly controversial trial and execution of several anarchists. Although not directly tied to mainstream unions, the Haymarket Affair damaged the broader labor movement by associating worker activism with violence in the public imagination. The Homestead Strike, by contrast, directly pitted organized labor against one of the era's most powerful corporations, Carnegie Steel. When manager Henry Clay Frick attempted to break the union by cutting wages and locking out workers, the conflict escalated into an armed battle between strikers and Pinkerton agents. The ensuing violence shocked the nation and ended in defeat for the workers, severely weakening steel unions for decades. 2 years later, the Pullman strike erupted when workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company protested wage cuts without reductions in rent for company-owned housing. The strike spread nationwide, disrupting rail traffic across much of the country. When federal troops intervened, violence ensued, and the strike collapsed. These events underscored the immense power imbalance between workers and employers, as well as the government's willingness to intervene on behalf of business interests. Yet they also strengthened the long-term resolve of labor activists and laid the foundation for the emergence of more durable organizations, like the American Federation of Labor. The labor wars of the Gilded Age thus became defining episodes in American history, illustrating the human cost of industrialization and revealing the deep struggles underlying the nation's economic transformation. The Gilded Age coincided with one of the greatest waves of immigration in American history, fundamentally reshaping the nation's labor force, culture, and social dynamics. Millions of newcomers arrived from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as smaller numbers from Scandinavia, China, and other parts of Asia. Many were fleeing political oppression, famine, poverty, religious persecution, or economic stagnation in their homelands. For these immigrants, the United States represented a place of possibility, an industrial engine hungry for workers and a country promoting, at least in rhetoric, the promise of opportunity and social mobility. However, the reality awaiting them was far more complex. Most immigrants landed with little money and limited English, forcing them into the lowest paying, most dangerous jobs in factories, mines, textile mills, and railroads. Living conditions mirrored their economic hardships, as many were crammed into overcrowded tenements lacking adequate sanitation, ventilation, or safety. Yet despite these struggles, immigrant communities developed tight-knit networks that helped newcomers find work, housing, and emotional support. Churches, ethnic clubs, newspapers, and mutual aid societies became crucial institutions that strengthened cultural bonds while helping individuals navigate a foreign and often hostile environment. These communities preserved traditions, languages, and religious practices, enriching the cultural fabric of American cities. At the same time, their presence intensified long-standing debates about national identity, economic competition, and cultural assimilation. Some Americans celebrated immigration for its role in fueling industrial growth, while others viewed it as a threat to social order and wages. Thus, immigration became one of the most defining social issues of the Gilded Age, both powering the industrial economy and igniting cultural conflict that would echo through American history. The influx of immigrants during the Gilded Age triggered widespread anxiety among certain groups of native-born Americans. Economic competition between new arrivals and domestic workers, particularly during periods of recession, often led to resentment and fear. Labor unions sometimes opposed immigration because employers used immigrant labor to break strikes or accept lower wages, thereby weakening union bargaining power. Beyond economic concerns, nativists believed that immigrants threatened the cultural and political fabric of the United States. They argued that newcomers, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe, could not fully assimilate into American society because of differences in language, religion, and customs. Anti-Catholic sentiment rose sharply as large numbers of Irish and Italian immigrants settled in cities. Immigrants from Eastern Europe faced suspicion due to their Jewish faith or their association, accurate or not, with radical political movements such as socialism or anarchism. These fears led to the emergence of organizations and political groups advocating for immigration restrictions. One of the most infamous examples was the American Protective Association, which sought to limit Catholic influence in politics and public institutions. Laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 reflected the growing xenophobia of the era, marking the first major federal restriction on immigration based explicitly on nationality and race. Chinese immigrants were portrayed as economic threats and cultural outsiders, leading to widespread discrimination and violence, particularly in the American West. Despite these challenges, immigrant workers continued to fill critical roles in the nation's industrial economy. Their labor built railroads, loaded ships, ran machines in factories, and performed the grueling tasks that kept America's cities and industries functioning. Nativist hostility did little to diminish their contributions. Instead, it highlighted the tension between America's self-image as a land of opportunity and its recurring impulse to exclude those perceived as different. The debate over who belongs in America and under what conditions became a defining characteristic of the Gilded Age and remains a contentious issue in modern society. Despite the hardships immigrants faced, discrimination, low wages, poor housing, and political exclusion, they played an essential and transformative role in shaping American labor movements, urban culture, and the overall trajectory of the nation. Immigrants formed the backbone of the industrial workforce, taking on roles in steel mills, coal mines, textile factories, and construction projects that built the modern American landscape. Their willingness to work long hours for low pay made them indispensable to employers, but it also placed them at the epicenter of labor struggles that defined the era. Many immigrant groups brought with them traditions of labor solidarity, socialist theory, and collective action, which influenced the development of unions, such as the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. Immigrant women played particularly significant roles, organizing strikes, participating in boycotts, and demanding better conditions not only for themselves, but for their families and communities. As immigrant populations grew, major cities saw the emergence of vibrant ethnic neighborhoods that preserved cultural traditions while adapting to American life. Little Italy, Chinatown, Polonia, and Jewish districts in places like New York and Chicago became centers of cultural creativity, commerce, and social activism. These neighborhoods gave rise to theaters, newspapers, schools, and community associations that enriched the cultural diversity of urban America. Yet assimilation remained an ongoing negotiation. Immigrants balanced the preservation of their heritage with the need to learn English, understand American laws, and adapt to new social norms. Children often became cultural intermediaries, navigating school systems that encouraged assimilation while maintaining connections to family traditions. Over time, immigrants became an integral part of the American story, reshaping the food, music, politics, and spiritual life of the nation. The Gilded Age's immigrant experience exemplifies the dual narrative of hardship and achievement that runs throughout American history. It reflects the enduring tensions between opportunity and exclusion, diversity and unity, economic necessity and cultural identity, a set of forces that continue to shape the United States in the 21st century. The Gilded Age was marked not only by industrial expansion and social transformation, but also by a deep entanglement between politics and corruption. As cities grew and populations surged, political machines emerged as powerful forces capable of shaping elections, distributing public resources, and controlling urban life. Machines like Tammany Hall in New York City became synonymous with the era, blending charitable assistance with outright bribery, patronage, and graft. Political machines thrived in conditions where government institutions were weak, bureaucratic oversight was minimal, and immigrant populations required basic services that the state often failed to provide. Ward bosses ensured that needy families received coal in the winter, jobs on public works projects, or housing assistance. In exchange, voters delivered unwavering loyalty during elections. The machine operated through a complex hierarchy. Local captains reported to district leaders, who in turn answered to citywide bosses. These organizations often worked hand in hand with business elites, granting lucrative contracts for construction, transit lines and sanitation systems in exchange for kickbacks and political contributions. While political machines provided a rough form of social welfare in an era without government safety nets, their tactics ultimately undermined democratic institutions. Elections were frequently manipulated through ballot stuffing, intimidation, or the distribution of patronage jobs. Corruption seeped into nearly every level of governance, influencing the awarding of franchises, the policing of neighborhoods, and the management of municipal budgets. Critics argued that machines valued loyalty over merit, leading to incompetent administration and widespread waste. Yet despite the moral outrage they generated, political machines endured for decades because they performed functions that the government failed to provide. Their rise reflects both the needs and failures of the Gilded Age, needs that reformers would soon attempt to address through major political and administrative changes. The most famous symbol of Gilded Age corruption was William M. Boss Tweed, the powerful leader of New York's Tammany Hall. Tweed and his associates ran one of the most sophisticated political rackets in American history, manipulating city finances for personal gain while maintaining strong support among the city's working class and immigrant populations. Under Tweed's leadership, Tammany Hall orchestrated elections by appointing loyalists to key roles, ensuring that ballot counts favored the machine's candidates. Once in power, Tweed's network controlled the flow of municipal contracts, awarding them to businesses willing to inflate costs and share the profits. The construction of the New York County Courthouse became the most notorious example. A project initially estimated at a few $100,000 ballooned to more than $12 million due to fraudulent accounting and kickbacks. Yet Tweed was not merely a thief. He cultivated loyalty by providing jobs, legal assistance, food, and emergency aid to impoverished families, particularly Irish immigrants who saw Tammany as a protective force in a hostile city. This dual nature, part corruption and part community support, made political machines difficult to dismantle. Reformers could expose graft, but they struggled to replace the social services machines offered. Tweed's downfall came largely through the efforts of political adversaries, reform-minded journalists, and cartoonist Thomas Nast, whose relentless illustrations in Harper's Weekly turned public opinion against the Tammany boss. Eventually, Tweed was arrested, tried, and imprisoned, becoming a cautionary symbol of political excess. But the fall of one man did not end machine politics. Even after Tweed's death, Tammany continued to dominate New York politics into the 20th century, adapting its methods and learning to operate more discreetly. The persistence of political machines highlighted a key truth of the Gilded Age. Corruption could not simply be eradicated through prosecution alone. It was embedded in the very structure of urban governance, fueled by inequality, desperation, and institutional weakness. And as the scale of political corruption became impossible to ignore, a growing movement of reformers, journalists, and civic leaders began pushing for structural changes that would make government more efficient, transparent, and accountable. This movement, often called the Good Government or Progressive Reform Movement, sought to dismantle the patronage system that allowed political machines to flourish. Reformers argued for the creation of civil service exams to ensure that government jobs were awarded based on merit rather than political loyalty. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883 marked a major step forward, establishing rules that protected certain federal employees from being fired for political reasons and requiring standardized exams for government positions. Although the law initially applied to only a small portion of federal workers, it set the foundation for a broader transformation of the public sector. At the municipal level, reformers pushed for professional city managers, nonpartisan elections, and greater transparency in budgeting and contracting. Investigative journalists, known as muckrakers, played an essential role in exposing corruption and galvanizing public support for reform. Writers like Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, and Ray Stannard Baker published detailed reports documenting bribery, monopolistic practices, and failures of governance. Their work helped ordinary citizens understand the scale of corruption and demand accountability. While reforms varied in effectiveness from city to city, they gradually weakened the grip of political machines and gave rise to modern administrative structures. The struggle for clean government was not merely a reaction to corruption. It reflected deeper anxieties about democracy in an industrial age. As corporations grew more powerful and cities expanded beyond anything the founders could have imagined, Americans grappled with the question of how to maintain representative government in a rapidly changing society. The reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries laid the groundwork for future waves of regulation, antitrust legislation, and professionalized public administration. They also signaled a shift in public expectations. Citizens increasingly demanded a government that was not only effective but also ethical, transparent, and committed to serving the public good rather than private interests. The Gilded Age was characterized by an extraordinary wave of technological innovation that fundamentally reshaped the American economy and laid the groundwork for the modern industrial world. While the nation had already experienced early industrialization before the Civil War, the period from the 1870s to 1900 witnessed a dramatic acceleration in invention, production, and technological diffusion. This surge was fueled by the close interplay between scientific research, engineering creativity, and vast amounts of private investment. Factories shifted from water power to steam and eventually to electricity. New machine tools enabled mass production at speeds and scales never before imagined. The telegraph, once a novelty, became a backbone of communication, and by the 1880s the telephone began expanding across cities, offices, and homes. These technologies created new industries, expanded existing ones, and transformed everything from manufacturing methods to business management. The railroad remained the era's dominant technological system, not merely as a means of transportation, but as a national framework for commerce, innovation, and corporate organization. Railroads standardized time zones, improved distribution networks, and connected distant markets, enabling manufactured goods to reach consumers thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, advances in steel production created stronger rails, allowing locomotives to pull heavier loads and merchants to ship goods more reliably. The spirit of innovation extended to agriculture as well, where inventions like mechanical reapers, seed drills, and improved plows increased productivity and reduced labor demands. These technological shifts changed the very rhythm of American life, speeding up communication, increasing production capacity, and drawing urban and rural economies closer together. The technological revolution of the Gilded Age reshaped the nation's identity, fueling growth, ambition, and the belief that human ingenuity could conquer almost any challenge. Among the many inventors who defined the Gilded Age, few had as profound an influence as Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and Nikola Tesla. Their contributions pushed America into a new technological frontier that modernized communication, illumination, and industrial power. Thomas Edison, often celebrated as the Wizard of Menlo Park, pioneered inventions that changed daily life for millions. His work on the incandescent light bulb led to the creation of the first electrical power grid, allowing cities to illuminate streets and homes with a level of safety and convenience gas lamps could never match. Edison's laboratories operated as some of the world's earliest research and development hubs, bringing together teams of scientists and engineers who could collaborate on systematic experimentation. This model later became standard in major corporations, creating a new relationship between invention and industry. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone revolutionized interpersonal communication. Though initially ridiculed by skeptics who viewed it as a novelty, the telephone quickly proved invaluable for businesses and families alike. It allowed instantaneous voice communication over long distances, making the world smaller and creating new opportunities for commerce, journalism, and personal connection. Meanwhile, Nikola Tesla's work on alternating current, AC, challenged Edison's direct current system and ushered in a technological rivalry known as the War of Currents. Tesla's AC system, backed by industrialist George Westinghouse, eventually prevailed due to its ability to transmit electricity over long distances with minimal power loss. This victory transformed American infrastructure, making widespread electrification feasible and enabling the expansion of factories, streetcars, and household appliances. These inventors, with their competing visions and relentless drive, symbolize the creative energy of the Gilded Age. Their innovations went beyond simple convenience. They redefined the possibilities of modern life and contributed to the creation of a high-tech, interconnected American society. The technological and industrial advancements of the Gilded Age brought enormous economic benefits, but they also disrupted older ways of life and created new challenges that ordinary Americans had to confront. Mechanization increased factory productivity but reduced the need for skilled artisans, replacing craft-based systems with mass production. This shift threatened traditional trades and created tension between older workers accustomed to autonomy and younger workers forced into repetitive industrial routines. Farmers also experienced upheaval as railroads and mechanized agriculture expanded market competition. While new farm machinery increased yields, it also required capital investment that drove many farmers into debt. Railroad monopolies often charged high freight rates, reducing farm profits and leading to widespread rural dissatisfaction, a frustration that would later give rise to populist movements demanding economic reforms. Meanwhile, the rapid spread of electricity and mechanized systems changed the geography of daily life. Factories built near rivers in earlier decades could now move closer to urban centers, where labor was abundant. Electric streetcars enabled workers to live farther from their workplaces, giving rise to early suburbs. Yet despite these conveniences, inequalities persisted. Not all communities gained access to technological improvements at the same pace. Wealthier districts in major cities received electrical grids, clean water, and better infrastructure years before poorer neighborhoods did. Rural areas waited even longer, and many small towns would not be fully electrified until the 1930s under New Deal programs. Technological change also created new forms of corporate power. Companies capable of controlling patents, networks, or supply chains, such as Edison's General Electric or Bell's growing telephone monopoly, could shape markets and influence consumer choices. These new industrial giants sparked debates about regulation, anti-monopoly laws, and the role of government in overseeing technological progress. Ultimately, the innovations of the Gilded Age brought enormous promise, but also underscored the need for society to manage change responsibly. They revealed the transformative potential of human creativity while reminding Americans that progress, unchecked, could deepen economic divides and provoke social upheaval. The era's technology became both a symbol of national pride and a source of ongoing tension, one that still resonates in today's debates about automation, inequality, and the power of modern tech corporations. The expansion of railroads during the Gilded Age was one of the most transformative developments in American history, forging a truly national market and reshaping the economic geography of the United States. Before the Civil War, regional economies operated somewhat independently, with transportation limitations keeping markets local and production largely tied to nearby consumers. But by the 1870s, railroads began stitching the continent together with steel rails that stretched across plains, mountains, and deserts, enabling both goods and people to move with unprecedented speed and reliability. The completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869 marked a symbolic and practical turning point. It dramatically shortened coast-to-coast travel from months to days and opened new economic possibilities for industries dependent on national distribution networks. Grain from the Midwest could be shipped to the East Coast. Manufactured goods from New England could reach western mining towns, and cattle driven from Texas could be transported to Chicago's stockyards and then distributed across the country. This integration of markets boosted efficiency, expanded consumer choices, and encouraged specialization in local economies. Railroads also stimulated the growth of related industries: coal mining, steel production, timber harvesting, and machine manufacturing, creating vast supply chains that employed hundreds of thousands of workers. The financial world, too, was reshaped by railroad expansion. Investors poured money into railroad companies, making them some of the largest and most influential corporations of the century. Their sheer scale required new systems of corporate governance, accounting, and management that eventually became models for other industries. Yet the railroads were not merely economic engines. They were cultural symbols of progress, ambition, and national unity. They embodied the belief that technology and industry could conquer geography and transform the continent. At the same time, the expansion of railroads also magnified inequalities, sparked land conflicts, and concentrated power in the hands of corporations whose decisions could shape entire regions. Thus, the railroad network became both the backbone of the industrial economy and a flashpoint for controversy, embodying the promises and perils of the Gilded Age. Despite their central role in national development, railroad companies became some of the most criticized and mistrusted institutions of the era. Their immense power allowed them to influence prices, politics, and even the fate of entire communities. Farmers, in particular, felt victimized by the monopolistic behavior of railroad corporations, which often charged exorbitant shipping rates that devoured agricultural profits. Because many rural regions were serviced by only one or two rail lines, farmers had no alternative and were forced to pay whatever rate the company demanded. This created widespread resentment and fueled populist movements demanding stronger government oversight. Small businesses, too, faced discriminatory pricing practices. Railroads frequently offered secret rebates or discounted rates to large corporations, especially oil trusts like Rockefeller Standard Oil, while charging higher fees to smaller competitors. These practices distorted competition, allowing dominant companies to grow even more powerful. The political influence of railroad magnates further inflamed public anger. Lobbyists bribed state legislators, secured favorable laws, and even dictated the selection of certain government officials. Corruption scandals, such as the Credit Mobilier affair, revealed how deeply intertwined railroad companies were with federal policy, sparking public outrage over the misuse of taxpayers' money. In response to mounting pressure, states began experimenting with regulations to limit railroad abuses. But because railroads crossed state lines, inconsistent rules created legal chaos. This eventually led to the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, the first federal regulatory agency. Although initially limited in power, the ICC represented a significant step toward government oversight of big business. It signaled a growing recognition that certain industries had become too powerful to remain unregulated. The conflict between railroads and the public reveals a core tension of the Gilded Age. The same corporations that drove economic growth also threatened democratic governance and economic fairness. Railroads symbolized progress, yet their unchecked power forced Americans to confront the darker consequences of industrial capitalism. Railroads not only transformed the economy and political landscape, they reshaped American society in countless ways, influencing migration patterns, settlement trends, and cultural interactions across the continent. Prior to the railroad boom, many regions of the West were sparsely populated, accessible mainly by wagon, horseback, or foot. But once rail lines were laid, towns sprang up almost overnight along the tracks, attracting settlers, merchants, and entrepreneurs eager to capitalize on new opportunities. Railroad companies themselves played a central role in promoting Western settlement, often selling millions of acres granted to them by the federal government. Their advertising campaigns portrayed the West as a land of boundless potential, drawing immigrants from Europe and migrants from the eastern United States. These settlers established farms, built communities, and expanded the nation's agricultural frontier. Yet this expansion came at a profound cost for indigenous peoples whose lands were seized, parceled out, or overrun by settlers and railroad projects. The collision between railroad expansion and indigenous sovereignty led to violent conflicts, forced relocations, and the erosion of traditional lifeways. In cities, railroads fueled the growth of suburbs by allowing middle-class families to live farther from their workplaces, beginning the long-term trend of urban decentralization. They also created new cultural connections, enabling newspapers, consumer goods, fashion trends, and entertainment to circulate more widely. Regional identities were gradually woven into a broader national culture, as Americans increasingly shared similar products, technologies, and experiences. Yet railroads also underscored class divisions. First-class passengers enjoyed luxurious cars, fine dining, and comfort, while immigrants and working-class travelers endured crowded conditions with minimal amenities. Despite these inequalities, the railroad experience symbolized the mobility and opportunity that so many associated with the American dream. Ultimately, the social impact of railroads was as far-reaching as their economic and political influence. They accelerated migration, facilitated cultural exchange, redefined regional boundaries, and altered the very perception of distance. In doing so, they helped forge a more connected and interdependent nation, one whose challenges and possibilities would continue to shape the trajectory of American society long after the Gilded Age ended. The Gilded Age ushered in a dramatic transformation in the scale, structure, and influence of American business. Before the Civil War, most companies were small, locally owned enterprises that relied on personal relationships, family labor, and small-scale production. But by the late 19th century, the United States witnessed the rapid emergence of enormous corporations capable of controlling entire industries. These corporations introduced new business models, managerial structures, and financial systems that would define modern capitalism. Their rise was fueled by national markets, technological innovation, and capital investment on an unprecedented scale. Major companies adopted strategies like vertical and horizontal integration to consolidate power and eliminate competition. Horizontal integration involved buying out or crushing competitors in the same industry. Standard Oil famously did this by absorbing or bankrupting rival oil refiners. Vertical integration, on the other hand, meant controlling every stage of production, from raw materials to transportation to manufacturing to distribution. Carnegie Steel perfected this strategy, owning iron mines, coal fields, rail lines, furnaces, and mills. These innovations made production more efficient and allowed corporations to set prices, dictate market conditions, and outcompete smaller firms. But the rapid rise of big business also brought profound changes to the workforce and to society as a whole. Massive factories required strict managerial hierarchies, creating layers of supervisors, foremen, accountants, and clerks. Workers became cogs in large corporate machines, their labor regimented by clock-driven schedules and scientific management practices. The corporate revolution also reshaped American culture, influencing everything from consumer habits to political ideals. The immense scale of corporate wealth raised questions about democracy, fairness, and the balance between private profit and public good. Big business did far more than dominate the economy. It reshaped the very fabric of American life, setting the stage for political reforms, labor movements, and economic debates that continue into the 21st century. The explosion of monopolies and trusts during the Gilded Age triggered widespread public debate about economic fairness, competition, and the proper role of government in regulating commerce. Corporations like Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, the American Tobacco Company, and various railroad conglomerates became so powerful that they could manipulate prices, influence legislation, and drive competitors out of the market with ease. Many Americans began to fear that the country was drifting toward a new form of aristocracy, not one based on hereditary titles, but on corporate power. Critics argued that monopolies stifled innovation, exploited workers, and distorted democracy by aligning political decisions with the interests of wealthy industrialists. Business leaders, however, defended their practices as necessary for efficiency and national progress. They argued that competition was wasteful, that consolidation allowed for economies of scale, and that large corporations offered stability in a volatile economy. These debates intensified with the rise of trusts, legal entities that allowed companies to combine under a single board of directors while appearing as separate firms. Trusts enabled corporations to control vast sections of the market, limiting consumer choice and setting prices at will. The public backlash eventually led to the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, the first major federal law aimed at restricting monopolistic practices. Although initially weak and poorly enforced, the law represented a crucial shift in the relationship between government and business. It signaled that the federal government had a responsibility to protect competition and prevent the concentration of economic power. The rise of trusts also motivated investigative journalists, soon known as muckrakers, to expose corporate abuses, bringing issues like price fixing, unfair labor practices, and political bribery into the national spotlight. The antitrust movement of the Gilded Age laid the groundwork for future waves of regulation, including the vigorous trust-busting campaigns of the Progressive Era. Ultimately, the debate over big business in the Gilded Age highlighted the tension between efficiency and fairness, innovation and inequality, private ambition and public welfare, tensions that remain central to modern capitalism. As corporations grew in size and complexity, they reshaped not only the economy, but also the daily lives of millions of Americans. The rise of big business created new classes of white-collar workers, clerks, accountants, managers, stenographers, and salesmen, whose jobs differed dramatically from traditional farm or factory labor. These positions required literacy, organizational skills, and adherence to bureaucratic routines. For many middle-class families, corporate employment represented stability and respectability, even if it lacked the autonomy and craftsmanship of earlier trades. Meanwhile, women gained new opportunities in clerical positions, making the typewriter and the office desk symbols of their expanding economic presence. Consumer culture flourished alongside big business. Mass production lowered prices, making goods like canned food, ready-made clothing, sewing machines, bicycles, and furniture accessible to a broad public. Department stores emerged as glittering palaces of commerce, offering fixed prices, advertisements, return policies, and a wide range of goods under one roof. These stores revolutionized the shopping experience, attracting middle-class customers with elegant window displays, seasonal sales, and luxurious interiors. Advertising grew into a major industry, shaping tastes and desires through newspapers, magazines, billboards, and catalogs like those of Sears, Roebuck and Company. The rise of consumer culture contributed to a growing sense of national identity, as Americans increasingly purchased the same products, read the same advertisements, and participated in similar commercial rituals. Yet the benefits of corporate capitalism were uneven. Workers faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and low wages, while executives and investors accumulated enormous fortunes. Rural communities often felt left behind as corporate power concentrated in urban centers. And the influence of business over politics raised concerns about corruption and democratic accountability. Still, the corporate revolution generated unprecedented economic growth and innovation. It helped define the modern United States as a country driven by large-scale enterprise, mass production, and national markets. In many ways, the Gilded Age marked the birth of corporate America, a system that continues to shape global economics, labor relations, and consumer culture today. The Gilded Age saw profound shifts in American social life, reshaping everything from class structure to family dynamics. As industries expanded and cities grew, millions of Americans found themselves adjusting to new roles and expectations in an increasingly complex society. Before this era, the United States was largely rural and agrarian, with social relationships rooted in local communities, small businesses, and family farms. But the rapid growth of factories, railroads, and corporate enterprises created new social classes and widened economic distinctions. A clear upper class emerged, composed of industrial tycoons, major financiers, railroad magnates, and the wealthy families that benefited from America's economic boom. These elites displayed their wealth through opulent mansions, luxurious lifestyles, and lavish social events, especially in New York's Millionaires Row and resorts like Newport, Rhode Island. Below them, a burgeoning middle class developed. Professionals, clerks, teachers, shop owners, and lower-level managers whose livelihoods depended on education, discipline, and steady employment. This group became increasingly influential in shaping American culture through their emphasis on respectability, moral reform, and family values. Meanwhile, the working class expanded rapidly, filled with immigrants, factory laborers, miners, railway workers, and domestic servants who endured long hours, unstable wages, and dangerous living conditions. Despite these hardships, working-class neighborhoods formed vibrant cultural enclaves where ethnic traditions, community support networks, and shared experiences helped people navigate their challenging environment. Family structures also evolved. In urban settings, extended families often lived together, pooling resources to survive economic uncertainty. Child labor was widespread, especially among poor families who depended on the wages of their children for survival. Women's roles shifted as increasing numbers entered the workforce, took on clerical jobs, or participated in social reform movements. The Gilded Age brought rapid change, and with it came new anxieties, cultural tensions, and social experiments. It was an era in which Americans confronted the realities of modern industrial life while struggling to maintain a sense of identity and community. The period's widening class divisions were perhaps most visible in the stark contrast between the lifestyles of the wealthy elite and the daily struggles of working families. The Gilded Age elite embraced a philosophy of conspicuous consumption, using their fortunes to display social status through extravagant mansions, designer clothing, private railway cars, and glittering parties attended by hundreds of guests. Figures like the Vanderbilts, Astors, Morgans, and Rockefellers became symbols of immense wealth. Their social events, lavishly described in newspapers, featured gold-plated tableware, imported decorations, European musicians, and outfits tailored in Paris. These displays served not only as entertainment, but also as a way to establish social hierarchy within high society. For the wealthy, leisure became an important marker of status. They traveled to resorts, funded opera houses, collected rare art, and joined exclusive clubs that kept their social circles tightly controlled. Meanwhile, the working class navigated an entirely different reality. Families lived in overcrowded tenements, often in neighborhoods without adequate sanitation, ventilation, or policing. Many workers endured 12 to 14-hour workdays, leaving little time for rest, let alone leisure. Women in poor households frequently took in laundry, sewing, or boarders to supplement their husband's earnings. Meals were simple and sometimes insufficient, as wages fluctuated or failed to keep up with rent and food costs. Working-class families formed mutual aid societies, attended community events, and built religious networks to help cope with hardships. Holidays and street festivals offered brief moments of relief from the monotony of industrial labor. As class divisions grew more visible, social observers feared that America was losing the sense of equality that had once defined its national identity. Reformers argued that unchecked wealth threatened social cohesion, while defenders of capitalism insisted that inequality reflected natural differences in talent and effort. These debates revealed the deep ideological fault lines at the heart of Gilded Age society, fault lines that would influence political movements, cultural conflicts, and reform efforts for decades. Culture in the Gilded Age became increasingly diverse, innovative, and commercialized, reflecting the dramatic changes in society and the growing influence of urban centers. Life in cities exposed individuals to new forms of entertainment, mass media, and cultural expression that blended traditional customs with modern trends. The rise of vaudeville theaters introduced audiences to variety shows featuring comedy, music, dance, and performers from immigrant communities. These shows became one of the era's most popular forms of entertainment, accessible to both the working class and the middle class. Newspapers grew rapidly, fueled by advances in printing technology and the fierce competition between publishers like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Sensationalist journalism, known as yellow journalism, grabbed readers with dramatic headlines, exaggerated stories, and investigative exposés. At the same time, magazines flourished, catering to specialized audiences interested in fashion, fiction, science, or political commentary. Literature reflected the complexities of modern life, with writers like Mark Twain, Henry James, and Edith Wharton exploring themes of ambition, morality, social change, and the contradictions of wealth. Art also flourished, with American painters experimenting with new styles influenced by European movements and the rapidly changing landscapes of industrial America. Sports became a major cultural phenomenon, with baseball emerging as the national pastime. Working class and immigrant communities embraced the game as a source of local pride and community identity, while professional leagues standardized rules and built stadiums that attracted massive crowds. Women participated in clubs, reform movements, and educational societies, pushing against the boundaries of traditional gender roles and using their growing influence to promote social change. The expansion of public libraries, settlement houses, and museums reflected the growing belief that culture and knowledge were essential tools for civic improvement. Yet cultural life was also marked by tensions between tradition and innovation, between high culture and popular entertainment, and between the desire for national unity and the celebration of diverse identities. The Gilded Age's cultural landscape captured the energy and contradictions of a nation undergoing rapid transformation, setting the stage for new artistic, intellectual, and social movements in the decades to come. The Gilded Age was a period of extraordinary change in the American West, a vast region undergoing simultaneous migration, settlement, conflict, and transformation. In earlier decades, the West had been idealized as a frontier of endless opportunity, a place where rugged individuals could build lives defined by freedom, self-reliance, and adventure. But between the 1870s and 1900, the region became far more complex and deeply entangled with national economic and political forces. Railroads played a central role in opening the West to extensive migration, with new lines connecting remote territories to cities across the country. Settlers could travel long distances in days rather than months. Railroad companies, granted millions of acres by the federal government, aggressively marketed land to farmers, immigrants, and entrepreneurs. Their advertisements, often published in dozens of languages, portrayed the West as a land of fertile soil, bright futures, and affordable property. This promotional campaign drew settlers from the Midwest, the South, and Europe, who established homesteads, ranches, and small towns across the plains and deserts. The Homestead Act of 1862 continued to offer opportunities for settlers to claim land by living on and improving it, reinforcing the belief that the West was a land of democratic opportunity. However, the reality on the ground was far more challenging. Plains farming required difficult adjustments in techniques, crops, and irrigation methods. Harsh winters, unpredictable droughts, insect infestations, and limited access to water made survival precarious. Many settlers struggled financially, borrowing heavily to buy equipment, seeds, and livestock, only to find themselves crushed by falling crop prices and rising transportation costs. Despite these hardships, communities grew and diversified. Towns developed around rail stations, mines, and ranching centers, creating local networks of trade, governance, and culture. Schools, churches, saloons, and newspapers formed the social backbone of frontier life. Women played essential roles in building communities, often taking on physically demanding farm labor while also establishing schools and community organizations. The West of the Gilded Age was a dynamic and shifting landscape, full of promise, but also marked by the harsh realities of environmental struggle, corporate influence, and cultural collision. One of the most consequential and devastating aspects of Western expansion during the Gilded Age was the forced displacement of indigenous peoples. For centuries, Native American nations had inhabited and managed the lands that settlers now sought to occupy. But as railroads expanded and the federal government pursued its policy of manifest destiny, indigenous tribes found themselves confronting increasing encroachment on their territories. Treaties were signed and repeatedly broken. Land was seized, and tribes were pushed onto reservations that restricted their mobility and limited their economic independence. Western settlement brought massive ecological disruptions. Declining buffalo populations, expanding cattle ranching, commercial hunting, and growing mining operations that profoundly affected indigenous cultures, especially those whose livelihoods depended on the plains' natural resources. Conflicts erupted as tribes resisted the loss of their lands and sovereignty. The 1870s and 1880s saw major confrontations, such as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defeated U.S. forces led by General Custer. Yet such victories were temporary. The U.S. Army's relentless campaigns, combined with federal policy, ultimately overwhelmed indigenous resistance. The massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 marked a tragic culmination of these conflicts, symbolizing the end of indigenous armed resistance in the U.S. West. The government's assimilationist policies further undermined tribal autonomy. The Dawes Act of 1887 attempted to break up communal landholding by dividing reservations into individual plots. Supporters claimed it would help indigenous people adopt civilized agricultural practices, but in practice it undermined traditional governance, fragmented tribal lands, and opened millions of acres to white settlers. Boarding schools, such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, aimed to forcibly assimilate indigenous children by prohibiting their languages, cultural practices, and spiritual traditions. These policies inflicted deep trauma that continues to affect indigenous communities today. Despite these hardships, indigenous peoples resisted in both overt and subtle ways, maintaining cultural traditions, practicing ceremonies in secret, and fighting legal battles to preserve their rights. The story of the Gilded Age West cannot be understood without recognizing the resilience of Native nations, whose histories reveal the profound consequences of American expansion and its ongoing struggles for justice and cultural survival. Western development during the Gilded Age was not limited to farming and indigenous displacement. It was also shaped by booming industries such as mining, ranching, and frontier commerce. Gold, silver, and copper strikes turned remote territories into instant boom towns, attracting miners, speculators, entrepreneurs, and fortune seekers from around the world. Towns like Deadwood, Tombstone, Leadville, and Virginia City sprang up almost overnight, characterized by a mix of opportunity, lawlessness, and rapid social transformation. Miners endured dangerous working conditions, explosions, cave-ins, toxic dust, and brutal hours, while mining companies grew wealthy from the extraction of natural resources. As mines expanded, companies introduced new technologies like hydraulic mining and deep shaft drilling, which increased productivity but also caused severe environmental damage, prompting early debates about conservation and land rights. Ranching also flourished in the West, with cowboys, many of whom were black, Mexican, or Native American, driving cattle across vast distances to railheads in Kansas and other states. The cowboy became a romanticized symbol of American independence, even though the reality of ranch work was harsh, repetitive, and often poorly paid. Over time, open-range ranching gave way to fenced pastures and large corporate ranches that transformed the culture and economics of cattle production. Small farmers frequently clashed with large ranching interests over access to water, land rights, and grazing areas. Conflicts such as the Johnson County War in Wyoming revealed the growing tensions between homesteaders and wealthy cattle barons. Meanwhile, the culture of the frontier developed its own identity. Saloons, gambling halls, and dance houses served as social hubs. Sheriffs and outlaws became legendary figures, and newspapers sensationalized life in the West, shaping national perceptions of frontier adventure. Yet beneath the mythology, the West was deeply connected to the broader national economy. Mining companies depended on eastern capital, ranchers relied on railroad companies, and frontier towns required manufactured goods shipped from distant factories. The Gilded Age West, often imagined as rugged and independent, was in reality intertwined with corporate expansion, government policy, and global markets. By 1900, the frontier that had once symbolized limitless opportunity was increasingly shaped by the same forces: industrialization, capitalism, and political centralization that defined the rest of the nation. The transformation of the West reflected both the aspirations and contradictions of the Gilded Age, offering a powerful lens through which to understand American identity, conflict, and change. In the decades following the Civil War, the American South underwent a profound transformation that shaped its social, economic, and political landscape for generations. Although the Gilded Age is often associated with Northern industrial growth and Western expansion, the South's story during this period is equally essential for understanding the nation's evolution. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, the South entered a new phase characterized by both continuity and change. Many white Southern leaders sought to reestablish political dominance and economic systems reminiscent of the antebellum era, but the realities of industrialization and national integration made a return to the old order impossible. Instead, the South embarked on a complex journey toward modernization, while still maintaining rigid racial hierarchies that ensured white supremacy remained firmly entrenched. The region's economy was overwhelmingly agricultural, relying heavily on cotton production as its primary cash crop. Yet plantation slavery had been replaced by sharecropping and tenant farming systems that trapped millions of black and poor white families in cycles of debt and poverty. Landowners provided seeds, tools, and land, while sharecroppers worked the fields and received a portion of the harvest as payment. Because the price of cotton fluctuated and interest rates were high, sharecroppers frequently owed more to landowners and credit merchants than they earned. This created an exploitative economic structure that resembled slavery in its lack of freedom and economic mobility. Despite the grim realities of rural life, the South also experienced the early stirrings of industrial development. Textile mills, tobacco factories, ironworks, and lumber operations began to emerge, often financed by Northern investors eager to take advantage of cheap Southern labor. Cities like Birmingham, Atlanta, and Richmond positioned themselves as industrial hubs in what boosters called the New South, a vision of modernization that aimed to attract capital, build railroads, and promote economic diversification. Yet even as these changes unfolded, racial violence, discriminatory laws, and political repression shaped Southern society. African Americans faced intimidation, lynchings, and systematic disenfranchisement, ensuring that political power remained concentrated in white hands. The Gilded Age South was therefore a region caught between the promise of modern economic development and the entrenched legacies of slavery. The political landscape of the post-Reconstruction South was dominated by efforts to restore white supremacy and prevent African Americans from exercising the rights they had briefly gained during Reconstruction. After federal troops withdrew in 1877, Southern states swiftly moved to dismantle the political gains black citizens had achieved. Formerly enslaved men had served in state legislatures, held local offices, and influenced governance in meaningful ways. But their growing political power threatened traditional elites who were determined to reclaim control. In response, white politicians and paramilitary groups used a mix of violence, intimidation, fraud, and legislation to suppress black political participation. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan employed terror tactics, night raids, threats, beatings, and murders to discourage African Americans from voting or running for office. Local governments and courts often turned a blind eye to these acts, providing implicit approval of racial violence. By the 1890s, Southern states began enacting a series of legal measures known collectively as Jim Crow laws. These laws institutionalized racial segregation in schools, transportation, public accommodations, and nearly every aspect of daily life. Voting restrictions such as literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and complex registration procedures disenfranchised the overwhelming majority of African American voters and even affected many poor white citizens. The Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, reinforced segregation by establishing the doctrine of separate but equal, giving legal legitimacy to a system that provided inferior resources and services to black communities. This legal discrimination intertwined with social customs that enforced racial boundaries through violence, humiliation, and public displays of white dominance. Lynching became a brutal mechanism for maintaining control, with hundreds of African Americans murdered by mobs without trial or accountability. Despite these oppressive conditions, African American communities developed strong institutions that fostered resilience, solidarity, and cultural expression. Churches played a central role, serving as centers of worship, education, community organization, and resistance. Black-owned newspapers, fraternal orders, and schools helped preserve dignity and advocate for justice. Leaders like Ida B. Wells used journalism and activism to expose the horrors of lynching and challenge the nation's complacency. The political struggles of African Americans during the Gilded Age laid the groundwork for the long civil rights battles that would define the 20th century. Economic life in the post-Reconstruction South was shaped by both hardship and adaptation. While the plantation system had collapsed with the end of slavery, the region continued to rely heavily on agriculture, especially cotton, which remained central to its economic identity. Sharecropping, the dominant labor system, trapped millions of families in poverty and debt, preventing them from achieving economic independence or securing long-term stability. Landowners, merchants, and banks exploited this system by extending credit at extremely high interest rates, ensuring that sharecroppers remained financially dependent and unable to leave their land. This arrangement kept the rural South economically stagnant and deeply unequal. However, the Gilded Age also saw significant efforts to modernize the regional economy. Southern boosters promoted the idea of the New South, a more industrial, urban, and diversified economy. Textile mills, particularly in the Carolinas and Georgia, took advantage of the proximity to raw cotton and the availability of cheap labor. These mills often employed entire families, including women and children, who worked long hours under harsh conditions. Tobacco became another major industry, supported by companies like the American Tobacco Company, which used aggressive marketing and consolidation to dominate the national market. Birmingham, Alabama, grew into a major center for steel and iron production, earning the nickname the Pittsburgh of the South. Yet industrialization in the South was distinct from that in the North. Wages were lower, unions were weaker, and employers frequently used racial divisions to prevent labor solidarity. African Americans were often excluded from skilled positions and confined to the hardest, lowest paid jobs. Even where economic growth occurred, its benefits were unevenly distributed. Rural poverty remained widespread, urban services lagged behind, and political structures ensured that elites retained control. Despite these challenges, communities innovated and adapted. African Americans established thriving business districts in cities like Atlanta and Durham, creating networks of mutual support and economic cooperation. Women became increasingly active in church groups, temperance organizations, and charitable societies, contributing to community building and local reform. The Southern economy of the Gilded Age was thus a mixture of continuity and change. It struggled with the legacies of slavery, embraced new forms of industry, and endured deep racial and class inequalities. Understanding this complex landscape is essential for grasping how modern Southern identity and many of its ongoing social and political debates took shape in these transformative decades. As the Gilded Age advanced, hundreds of thousands of farmers across the United States, particularly in the South, Midwest, and Great Plains, found themselves trapped in a cycle of economic hardship, debt, and political marginalization. Their struggles contrasted sharply with the industrial prosperity celebrated in cities and underscored the uneven nature of national growth. While factories hummed, railroads expanded, and corporate profits soared, farmers confronted falling crop prices, rising transportation costs, exploitative credit systems, and a lack of political representation. The global economy amplified these pressures. International competition drove down the price of agricultural goods, while domestic monopolies kept shipping rates artificially high. Railroads charged small farmers much more per mile than large corporate shippers, exploiting the lack of competition in many rural regions. Grain elevator operators, merchants, and banks controlled the flow of credit and storage, creating a system in which farmers were consistently squeezed from all sides. These growing grievances led to a rising sense of frustration and collective identity among rural Americans. Many began to realize that their struggles were not isolated, but part of a broader pattern created by national economic structures that favored industrial and financial elites. In this context, grassroots organizations emerged to help farmers navigate challenges and advocate for their rights. The most influential of these early groups was the Grange, or Patrons of Husbandry, founded in 1867. Initially a social organization aimed at providing community and education, the Grange quickly evolved into a political force. Members cooperatively purchased supplies, built shared storage facilities, and campaigned for railroad regulation. Although the Grange eventually declined, it laid the foundation for a broader agrarian movement. By the 1880s, farmers across the South and Midwest formed farmers' alliances to address chronic economic injustices and demand structural reforms. The stage was set for one of the most significant populist movements in American history, a movement that sought to challenge corporate power, democratize politics, and reimagine the nation's economic future. The farmers' alliances, especially the Southern Alliance and the Northwestern Alliance, developed into powerful organizations with sophisticated political platforms. They argued that farmers were being systematically exploited by monopolistic railroads, predatory banks, and indifferent politicians aligned with corporate interests. The alliances promoted cooperative purchasing and marketing systems to help farmers bypass middlemen and secure fair prices for their goods. They advocated for federal regulation of railroads, a graduated income tax, and the establishment of government-run warehouses where farmers could store their crops and obtain low-interest loans through a proposed sub-treasury system. This plan aimed to stabilize prices, reduce farmers' dependence on private creditors, and introduce a more flexible currency that reflected agricultural needs. Alliance leaders traveled from town to town, giving speeches, organizing chapters, and mobilizing rural Americans into a cohesive political force. Women played significant roles in this movement, such as Mary Elizabeth Lease, who famously declared that farmers should raise less corn and more hay. Despite their growing influence, the alliances faced internal divisions over race and regionalism. In the South, white leaders often refused to cooperate with black farmers, prompting African American agricultural workers to form the Colored Farmers Alliance. This group became a major organization in its own right, representing over 1 million black farmers by the late 1880s. Although collaboration between the two alliances was limited due to entrenched racial tensions, both shared common grievances and goals. By the early 1890s, many alliance members concluded that meaningful change required direct political action, not just economic cooperation. This realization led to the formation of the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party, in 1892. The Populist platform called for sweeping reforms, nationalizing railroads, expanding the money supply through the free coinage of silver, implementing progressive taxation, and increasing direct democracy through initiatives like the direct election of U.S. senators. The Populists represented one of the most ambitious grassroots movements in American political history, seeking to challenge the dominance of corporate capitalism and restore power to farmers, workers, and ordinary citizens. The Populist Party's emergence marked a dramatic moment in Gilded Age politics, as millions of rural Americans attempted to reshape the national conversation around economic justice and democratic representation. In the 1892 presidential election, populist candidate James B. Weaver won more than 1 million votes and carried several western states, a remarkable achievement for a new third party. Populists also won seats in Congress and state legislatures, influencing political debates from Washington to the prairies. Their platform, known as the Omaha Platform, criticized the concentration of wealth, condemned corporate monopolies, and called for a government that served the needs of the people rather than industrial barons. Issues like railroad regulation, financial reform, anti-monopoly legislation, and the protection of workers' rights became key components of populist identity. The movement reached its peak in 1896 when the Democratic Party adopted parts of its platform and nominated William Jennings Bryan for president. His famous Cross of Gold speech electrified supporters by arguing that the gold standard crushed working people and farmers under a system designed to enrich bankers and creditors. Although Bryan embraced silver coinage, a central populist demand, the political fusion between populists and Democrats created internal tensions. Some feared that aligning with the Democrats would dilute the independence and radical vision of the populist cause. In the end, Bryan lost the 1896 election to Republican William McKinley, whose campaign was heavily financed by industrial and financial elites. This defeat dealt a severe blow to the populist movement, undermining its political momentum. Economic recovery in the late 1890s further reduced the urgency of some populist demands. Yet despite its decline, the populist movement left a lasting legacy. Many of its proposals, such as railroad regulation, the direct election of senators, progressive taxation, and banking reform, were eventually adopted during the Progressive Era and later in the New Deal. The populists also demonstrated the power of grassroots organizing and the ability of ordinary Americans to challenge corporate domination. Their struggle highlighted deep structural problems in the American economy, problems that still resonate today in debates over inequality, monopoly power, and political representation. Ultimately, the populist movement stands as a testament to the capacity of democratic activism to reshape national priorities, even in the face of overwhelming institutional opposition. The Gilded Age was a pivotal era for American women as social, economic, and cultural transformations opened new opportunities while simultaneously reinforcing traditional expectations. Before this period, women's roles were largely confined to domestic spheres, defined by the ideology of separate spheres, which held that women belonged in the home while men engaged in public life. But industrialization, urbanization, and expanding educational opportunities began to challenge these assumptions. Millions of women, particularly those from working class or immigrant families, entered the labor force, taking jobs in textile mills, garment factories, food processing plants, domestic service, and later in clerical offices. Their wages were often low, and their working conditions were harsh, but but employment brought a measure of financial independence and exposure to ideas that reshaped their understanding of identity and purpose. Middle-class women had different experiences, increasingly engaging in educational and cultural pursuits. Colleges for women expanded rapidly, including institutions like Vassar, Wellesley, and Smith, providing new intellectual horizons and professional aspirations. Women began entering fields such as teaching, nursing, librarianship, journalism, and social work. Professions considered extensions of their natural talents for caregiving and organization. Despite the limitations placed upon them, these roles allowed women to become influential in shaping public life. The era's social problems, urban poverty, child labor, political corruption, labor exploitation, and public health challenges motivated many middle-class women to join reform movements, giving rise to the progressive spirit even before the progressive era formally began. Though weighed down by legal and cultural barriers, women's expanding presence in education, labor, and civic engagement showed that the foundations for modern gender equality were being laid during the Gilded Age. The late 19th century witnessed the dramatic rise of women's activism, especially as growing numbers became involved in organized reform movements addressing social justice, labor conditions, and political rights. One of the most influential networks was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, founded in 1874. While temperance, opposition to alcohol, was its central cause, the WCTU quickly expanded into broader campaigns promoting public health, prison reform, education, and the protection of women and children from domestic violence. Led by dynamic figures such as Frances Willard, the organization framed its mission around home protection, arguing that women needed a political voice to safeguard their families from the social harms caused by alcohol, poverty, and corruption. This argument subtly challenged traditional gender norms by linking domestic responsibilities to public activism. Another crucial avenue of activism emerged through the settlement house movement, most famously represented by Hull House in Chicago, founded in 1889 by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. Settlement houses offered services to immigrant families, daycare, education, healthcare, English classes, and cultural programs, while also conducting research on living conditions, wages, sanitation, and factory safety. Women like Addams introduced a new model of public service rooted in compassion and social science, blending community care with political advocacy. Their work provided a foundation for policies such as improved sanitation systems, workplace safety laws, and juvenile courts. Meanwhile, female workers, especially those in the garment industry, became increasingly vocal about unjust labor practices. They organized strikes, formed unions, and demanded shorter hours, higher wages, and safer conditions. These efforts were not limited to white women. Immigrant women, particularly Jewish and Italian workers, played leading roles in labor activism in urban centers. Women's collective organizing demonstrated that they were no longer willing to accept second-class status in the workplace or in society. Their activism challenged the assumption that politics belonged exclusively to men and expanded the nation's understanding of what citizenship could mean. Perhaps the most defining struggle of women in the Gilded Age was the ongoing fight for suffrage, the right to vote. Although the women's suffrage movement had deep roots stretching back to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, the Gilded Age marked a crucial period of reorganization, expansion, and renewed strategy. After the Civil War, suffrage activists faced a painful divide over the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote but excluded women. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton opposed the amendment on the grounds that it extended rights to men while leaving women behind, whereas others supported it as a necessary step toward broader equality. This division led to the creation of rival organizations. The National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA, led by Anthony and Stanton, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, AWSA, which pursued a state-by-state strategy. Despite differences, both organizations worked tirelessly to promote women's political rights through petitions, lectures, conventions, and publications. By the late 1880s, they recognized the need for unity, and in 1890 the groups merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, which became the dominant suffrage organization in the country. Under leaders such as Carrie Chapman Catt, the movement adopted a more moderate tone, arguing that women's moral influence would purify politics and strengthen the nation. Western states proved particularly receptive to suffrage activism, with Wyoming granting women the right to vote in 1869, followed by Colorado, Utah, and Idaho in the 1890s. These victories provided momentum and demonstrated that suffrage was not only possible, but politically and socially viable. Still, many challenges persisted. Entrenched gender norms, political opposition, and cultural anxieties slowed progress in much of the nation. Critics argued that politics would corrupt women or that women lacked the temperament for public life. Yet suffrage activists countered with powerful stories of women's contributions to society and the injustices they faced under existing laws. They emphasized that women paid taxes, worked in factories, raised families, and upheld communities, yet had no voice in the government that shaped their lives. By the end of the Gilded Age, the suffrage movement had built a national network of supporters, established effective organizational structures, and laid the groundwork for eventual success with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The persistence, courage, and organizational brilliance of Gilded Age women helped reshape American democracy, opening doors that future generations would continue to push forward. African American life in the Gilded Age was defined by extraordinary resilience in the face of profound oppression. After the end of Reconstruction in 1877, African Americans experienced a dramatic reversal of political and social progress. The promise of freedom and citizenship offered during the immediate post-Civil War years was systematically undermined by Southern laws, customs, and violence designed to enforce white supremacy. Despite these formidable challenges, Black communities developed institutions, strategies, and cultural practices that allowed them to survive, resist, and continue striving for equality. Economic life for most African Americans was deeply constrained. Sharecropping and tenant farming locked families into cycles of debt that mirrored the bondage of slavery. Landowners controlled access to credit, supplies, and essential goods, forcing Black farmers to surrender large portions of their crop yields to pay off debts that were often manipulated through dishonest accounting. Because African Americans rarely had access to their own land or fair employment, mobility and financial independence remained difficult to achieve. Still, some families managed to acquire property, especially in areas with less oppressive credit systems or in regions where Black communities established cooperative networks. In cities, African Americans found work in domestic service, construction, railroads, and small businesses, though opportunities were limited by pervasive discrimination. Yet economic hardship did not extinguish Black ambition or creativity. Communities pooled resources to support schools, churches, and mutual aid societies that became essential anchors of social life. Education was considered a critical pathway to empowerment. Despite chronic underfunding and threats from white supremacist groups, African American teachers and parents built schools across the South, often in makeshift churches or private homes. Literacy rates among African Americans rose dramatically in these decades, demonstrating an unyielding commitment to learning. Religion served as both a spiritual refuge and a platform for resistance. Black churches, particularly Baptist and AME congregations, grew rapidly, becoming centers of leadership, social organization, and activism. Ministers provided moral guidance, facilitated political meetings, and encouraged community solidarity. These institutions cultivated resilience, preserved cultural identity, and nurtured future civil rights leaders. In the face of widespread oppression, African American communities persevered, laying the foundations for the cultural and political movements that would shape the 20th century. The Gilded Age was also a period of intense racial violence and systemic repression, driven by the efforts of white Southerners to cement racial hierarchies. Lynchings became terrifyingly common, used not only as tools of punishment, but also as instruments of terror to maintain social control. Thousands of African Americans were murdered under accusations that rarely resulted in formal charges and almost never in legal trials. These killings were often public spectacles, attended by crowds, including children, and sometimes commemorated through postcards or newspaper coverage. The barbarity of lynching revealed the extent to which white supremacy permeated legal, political, and cultural institutions. In this environment, resistance required remarkable courage, and one of the most courageous figures of the era was Ida B. Wells. As a journalist, Wells used the power of the press to expose the horror of lynching and challenge the myths that surrounded it. Her investigative reporting revealed that many lynchings were motivated not by criminal offenses, as white newspapers claimed, but by racial hatred, economic jealousy, or the desire to enforce social control. Through pamphlets, newspaper columns, and public lectures, even traveling internationally, Wells pushed the anti-lynching movement into the national spotlight. Her activism demonstrated how African American intellectuals and journalists used media to fight injustice long before the rise of modern civil rights strategies. Meanwhile, African Americans pursued legal challenges against discriminatory laws. Activists argued that segregation and disenfranchisement violated the 14th and 15th Amendments, but courts often sided with white lawmakers. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, was particularly devastating. By ruling that separate but equal facilities were constitutional, the court legalized a broad system of racial segregation that would persist for decades. African Americans also confronted new forms of exclusion outside the South. In northern cities, discrimination limited employment opportunities, segregated neighborhoods, and restricted social mobility. While violence was less widespread than in the South, racism remained deeply entrenched through job discrimination, housing barriers, and informal segregation. Yet resistance persisted through everyday acts. Families educating their children, communities forming business networks, churches organizing mutual aid, and individuals asserting dignity in hostile environments. The collective determination of African Americans during the Gilded Age built a powerful foundation for future activism, proving that even under the worst conditions, resistance could not be extinguished. The cultural life of African Americans during the Gilded Age flourished in ways that revealed both creativity and defiance. Despite economic and political oppression, Black communities produced remarkable expressions of art, music, literature, and intellectual thought that would influence American culture for generations. One of the most significant cultural developments of this era was the evolution of African American music. Spirituals, work songs, and traditional African rhythms blended to create early forms of blues and gospel. These musical traditions carry deep emotional and historical meaning, offering both comfort and a method of storytelling. In churches, choirs developed complex harmonies that laid the groundwork for future musical innovations. In rural areas, field hollers and folk songs served as expressions of endurance and identity, subtly critiquing oppression while preserving community memory. These musical foundations would later influence jazz, one of America's greatest cultural exports. African American literature also blossomed during this era. Writers like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Charles Chestnut, and Pauline Hopkins explored themes of racial identity, injustice, resistance, and the complexities of life under segregation. Their stories challenged white stereotypes, exposed the realities of racial violence, and celebrated the richness of black culture. Intellectual movements gained momentum as well. One of the most influential thinkers of the Gilded Age was Booker T. Washington, whose philosophy emphasized vocational training, economic self-reliance, and accommodation to white power structures as a strategy for gradual progress. Washington's leadership at the Tuskegee Institute transformed it into a model for industrial education. However, his ideas sparked debate within the African American community. Critics like W.E.B. Du Bois argued that Washington's approach compromised too much and failed to challenge systemic racism directly. Du Bois advocated for political activism, higher education, and the development of a talented 10th who would lead the broader community toward full justice and equality. These intellectual debates revealed the complexity and diversity of African American thought during the Gilded Age. Meanwhile, black women played essential roles in shaping cultural and community life. Leaders like Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, and others advanced education, founded women's clubs, and fought for both gender and racial equality. The Black Women's Club movement became especially powerful, promoting self-improvement, civic engagement, and community uplift. Through these cultural, intellectual, and artistic contributions, African Americans forged a vibrant identity that transcended the brutal limitations of the era. Their creativity and resilience during the Gilded Age helped shape the future trajectory of American culture, civil rights, and national consciousness. The Gilded Age was not only an era of industrial growth and social upheaval. It was also a period of profound scientific and medical transformation that would ultimately reshape American life. As cities grew and populations surged, public health challenges intensified dramatically. Urban centers faced overcrowded housing, polluted water sources, inadequate sanitation, and frequent outbreaks of infectious diseases. Cholera, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, diphtheria, smallpox, and influenza were common threats that spread rapidly through densely packed tenements and poorly ventilated factories. These conditions forced the nation to confront the consequences of industrialization on human health. In the early decades of the Gilded Age, medical science remained limited. Many physicians still relied on outdated theories such as miasma, the belief that bad smells cause disease, and treatments like bloodletting, purging, or untested folk remedies. Hospitals were often unsanitary, and surgery was risky as antiseptic principles were not yet widely practiced. However, the latter half of the 19th century witnessed groundbreaking discoveries that revolutionized medical understanding. Louis Pasteur's germ theory, which demonstrated that microorganisms caused infections, challenged long-held beliefs, and opened the door to scientific medicine. Joseph Lister's work on antiseptics showed that sterilization dramatically reduced surgical infections, prompting a gradual transformation in hospital practices. American physicians and researchers began adopting these innovations, though not without resistance from traditionalists who mistrusted new scientific methods. As germ theory spread, public health campaigns emphasized cleanliness, vaccination, and sanitation. cities began investing in sewer systems, water purification plants, and garbage removal services. Medical schools shifted from apprenticeship-style training to scientific curricula that emphasized laboratory research and clinical observation. The Gilded Age's public health revolution was therefore inseparable from its scientific progress. For the first time, Americans could begin to imagine a society in which disease was not a constant and uncontrollable threat, but something that could be prevented through knowledge, policy, and collective action. These advancements laid the foundation for modern medicine and transformed the relationship between individuals, communities, and the state in the realm of health. As science advanced, cities became the primary battlegrounds for public health reform. Rapid urbanization created conditions ripe for disease. Families crowded into tenements without ventilation or running water, sewage overflowed into streets, and garbage piled up for weeks at a time. Industrial pollution filled the air with smoke and toxic chemicals. Reformers, health officials, and scientists recognized that improving public health required structural changes, not simply individual responsibility. Municipal governments began to establish health departments tasked with monitoring sanitation, enforcing cleanliness regulations, and collecting vital statistics such as birth and death records. New York City's Metropolitan Board of Health, founded in 1866, became a pioneering institution that influenced public health policy nationwide. Inspectors visited homes, factories, and food markets to enforce standards, an unprecedented practice in American governance. These reforms often met resistance from landlords, business owners, and residents who feared increased taxes or government intrusion. Nevertheless, evidence showed that sanitation improvements significantly reduced disease. By the 1890s, cities across the country were investing in water filtration systems that removed harmful bacteria. The introduction of chlorination in the early 20th century would later mark a turning point in preventing waterborne illnesses. Public vaccination campaigns expanded as well, particularly in response to smallpox outbreaks. Although vaccines existed earlier, the Gilded Age brought more systematic strategies for distribution, record-keeping, and enforcement. Schools and workplaces sometimes required proof of vaccination, sparking debates that foreshadowed contemporary discussions about public health mandates and individual freedoms. Meanwhile, advances in microbiology transformed food safety. Scientists discovered that milk, widely consumed by children, often carried dangerous pathogens due to contamination and improper storage. Reformers introduced pasteurization, a method of heating milk to kill bacteria. Although resisted at first by dairy producers who viewed it as an unnecessary expense, pasteurization eventually became standard practice, dramatically reducing infant mortality. Housing reformers like Jacob Riis exposed the connection between living conditions and disease through photographs and investigative journalism. His work prompted new building codes requiring windows, ventilation shafts, and limits on overcrowding. Settlement houses, run largely by women, offered healthcare services, hygiene education, and nutrition programs in poor neighborhoods. These collective efforts redefined the meaning of public health. No longer limited to doctors treating individual patients, public health became a societal responsibility that demanded collaboration among scientists, policymakers, activists, and the general population. The Gilded Age thus established the basic framework for the modern public health system. The scientific transformations of the Gilded Age extended beyond public health, influencing fields such as chemistry, physics, biology, and engineering. Universities expanded their research capacities, inspired in part by German scientific institutions that emphasized laboratory training and advanced research. American colleges modernized their science programs, building laboratories and hiring professionally trained scientists. Johns Hopkins University, founded in 1876, became the nation's first research university and set new standards for graduate education. Its influence spread quickly, prompting other institutions to adopt similar models. This shift marked a profound change in American intellectual life, as scientific inquiry gained prestige and authority. New technologies emerged from this research environment. Electrical engineering experienced rapid progress, thanks to the efforts of inventors like Edison and Tesla, whose work on electricity revolutionized modern life. Advances in physics and material science supported the growth of industry, helping engineers design stronger machinery, safer bridges, and more efficient manufacturing systems. Chemistry saw breakthroughs in synthetic dyes, fertilizers, and pharmaceuticals, which contributed to the development of new consumer goods and agricultural practices. Meanwhile, advancements in biology deepened human understanding of life processes. Scientists began to explore cellular structures, heredity, and the mechanisms of disease. Although genetics would not fully emerge until the early 20th century, the foundations were laid during this period through experiments that explored inheritance and variation. Scientific journals proliferated, allowing researchers to share findings quickly and build a more interconnected community of knowledge. Medical training also underwent a transformation. While earlier generations of doctors often learned through apprenticeships, the late 19th century brought rigorous medical education, standardized curricula, anatomical training, and clinical rotations. Professional associations such as the American Medical Association worked to improve standards and combat quackery, though alternative medicine movements still attracted followers. Nursing emerged as a respected profession thanks to pioneers like Florence Nightingale and American reformers who established training schools attached to major hospitals. Nurses played crucial roles in improving patient care, hygiene, and recovery outcomes. By the end of the Gilded Age, science and medicine had fundamentally altered American society. Life expectancy slowly increased, urban mortality rates declined, and public trust in scientific methods grew stronger. While many social problems remained, the era's scientific advancements gave Americans new tools to understand and address the challenges of modern life. The Gilded Age became a bridge between a world governed by superstition, limited knowledge, and rudimentary care, and a world increasingly shaped by scientific inquiry, technological innovation, and systematic health policies. This transformation set the stage for the even more dramatic medical revolutions of the 20th century. Religion in the Gilded Age underwent profound transformation as Americans grappled with the rapid social, economic, and technological changes reshaping their world. The industrial boom created new wealth, but also new poverty, new opportunities, but also new insecurities. In this environment of upheaval, religion served as both a sanctuary and a catalyst for reform. Traditional Protestant denominations remained dominant. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists, but their teachings were increasingly influenced by debates over science, evolution, biblical interpretation, and the moral challenges of modern urban life. As cities expanded, churches struggled to minister to diverse and rapidly growing populations. Many urban churches lost members to suburban migration, while others adapted by focusing on social outreach programs that addressed poverty, illness, illiteracy, and moral decline. The social gospel movement emerged from these efforts, inspired by clergymen who argued that Christianity must confront the injustices created by industrial capitalism. Leaders like Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch insisted that Christianity meant more than personal salvation. It required active engagement with social problems like labor exploitation, corrupt politics, unsafe housing, and income inequality. Their sermons called on congregations to see workers as neighbors, not merely laborers, and to pursue economic justice as a moral duty. The social gospel provided theological justification for progressive reform and attracted followers across denominational lines. Simultaneously, evangelical revivals continued to flourish, emphasizing personal repentance, moral discipline, and spiritual rebirth. Revivalist preachers like Dwight L. Moody drew massive crowds with emotionally charged sermons that spoke to the uncertainties of modern life. Moody's message distilled Christianity into simple, accessible terms, focusing on faith, forgiveness, and morality. His revival tours filled arenas, converted thousands, and reinvigorated evangelical traditions at a moment when many felt disoriented by the speed of change. Together, these religious movements reveal an America struggling to reconcile faith with modernity. They show how religion served not only as a source of comfort, but also as a framework for confronting the ethical dilemmas of industrialization, economic inequality, and urbanization. As the Gilded Age progressed, religious communities also became central to the era's major moral reform movements. The fight against alcohol, the campaign for temperance, drew millions of supporters who viewed drinking as a root cause of family breakdown, crime, poverty, and workplace accidents. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCDU, though primarily a women's organization, cooperated closely with religious groups to promote abstinence and moral reform. Churches held temperance meetings, published pamphlets, and encouraged congregations to pledge sobriety. The temperance movement's religious fervor stemmed from the belief that sin and societal decay were intimately connected, and that moral reform was essential to national progress. Temperance activism often intersected with efforts to regulate saloons, improve labor conditions, and expand women's rights. Meanwhile, Protestant missionaries intensified their work both at home and abroad. Domestic missions targeted immigrants, indigenous peoples, and urban poor families, groups perceived as needing moral guidance or religious uplift. Missionaries established schools, reading rooms, settlement houses, and Sunday schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Their work combined religious education with practical support, though it sometimes reflected paternalistic attitudes that dismissed the cultural traditions of the communities they served. Overseas missionary work expanded as well, reflecting America's growing global presence. Missionaries traveled to China, Japan, Africa, and the Pacific, bringing with them not only Christian teachings, but also Western cultural values. Their efforts played a controversial role in shaping international perceptions of the United States and influencing global interactions. While missionaries viewed their work as benevolent, critics argued that it reinforced imperial attitudes and contributed to cultural disruption in the regions they targeted. Other religious groups also grew in influence during this period. Jewish immigrants, particularly from Eastern Europe, built vibrant synagogues, cultural centers, and mutual aid societies in American cities. Catholicism expanded rapidly due to immigration from Ireland, Italy, and Germany, leading to the establishment of parochial schools, hospitals, and charitable organizations. Protestant elites often viewed Catholics with suspicion, fearing that loyalty to the Pope would undermine American democratic values. These tensions fueled nativist movements, revealing how religion and ethnicity intertwined with broader social anxieties. Yet despite prejudice, Catholic and Jewish communities thrived, enriching American religious diversity and challenging the dominance of Protestant cultural norms. The Gilded Age also witnessed significant intellectual and theological debates as religious leaders struggled to respond to scientific advancements, modern scholarship, and philosophical challenges. The publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859 had already sparked controversy, but by the late 19th century, evolutionary theory had gained considerable traction among scientists and academics. This created a rift within religious communities. Some theologians embraced evolution, arguing that it could coexist with religious belief through frameworks like theistic evolution. They saw no contradiction between scientific discovery and divine creation, viewing evolution as a possible instrument of God's design. Others, however, fiercely rejected evolutionary theory, claiming it undermined biblical authority, divine purpose, and moral order. These disputes contributed to the rising tension between modernist and fundamentalist branches of Protestantism. Modernists advocated for flexible biblical interpretation, integration of science, and adaptation to contemporary culture. Fundamentalists insisted on literal readings of Scripture and viewed modern science as a threat to religious truth. This conflict would intensify in the early 20th century, eventually culminating in the famous Scopes monkey trial, but its roots lay firmly in the Gilded Age. Meanwhile, new religious movements emerged, reflecting the era's experimental spirit. Groups like the Theosophical Society, Christian Science, and the Holiness Movement attracted followers with their unconventional teachings, promises of healing, or reinterpretations of spiritual truth. Many Americans, disillusioned by urban hardships or shaken by the uncertainties of modern life, sought alternative paths to meaning. These new movements blended mystical ideas, Eastern philosophies, metaphysical healing techniques, and critiques of materialism, challenging mainstream religious thought. At the same time, African American religious life evolved in powerful ways. Black churches became essential spaces for community empowerment, political expression, and cultural identity. They developed unique worship styles, blending African traditions with Christian hymns, creating emotional forms of worship that emphasized resilience, hope, and collective struggle. Black religious leaders became vital community figures, advocating for civil rights, education, and resistance against oppression. By the end of the Gilded Age, religion in America had become far more pluralistic, dynamic, and contested than ever before. It served as a unifying force for some, a battleground of ideas for others, and a source of strength for communities struggling under economic or racial injustice. The era's religious shifts reflected the broader transformations of American society, its conflicts, aspirations, fears, and evolving identity. The Gilded Age marked a dramatic turning point in the history of American education and intellectual life. As the United States transitioned from a largely agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse, new demands emerged for a trained, literate, and technically skilled population. Education became increasingly essential, not only for economic mobility, but also for navigating the complexities of modern society. Public school systems expanded rapidly during these decades, driven by both civic ideals and practical necessity. Urbanization made it nearly impossible for children to learn exclusively at home, while new technologies required workers who could read instructions, understand machinery, and perform basic calculations. Reformers emphasized compulsory education as a means of promoting social stability and assimilation, particularly among immigrant populations. States gradually passed laws requiring school attendance, although enforcement varied widely. Classrooms were often overcrowded, underfunded, and staffed by teachers who struggled with limited training. Yet despite these challenges, literacy rates rose, and the idea that all children deserved access to education became increasingly accepted. Beyond primary schooling, the Gilded Age witnessed the birth of the modern high school. Initially viewed as a luxury suitable only for the upper classes, high school education spread rapidly into middle-class communities as new curricula incorporated practical subjects like bookkeeping, chemistry, engineering principles, and modern languages. These programs reflected the needs of a dynamic economy hungry for clerks, technicians, and managers. Meanwhile, rural Americans faced obstacles due to geographic isolation and underfunded schools, prompting reform movements to strengthen rural education and provide better training for teachers. The era also saw significant growth in private and religious schools, especially Catholic parochial schools built in response to suspicion and discrimination within Protestant-dominated public systems. Education became a key battleground for debates about national identity, socioeconomic equality, cultural assimilation, and the responsibilities of a democratic society. While inequality remained significant, the Gilded Age laid the foundations for the American commitment to widespread public education and the belief that learning was central to both personal advancement and national progress. Higher education underwent a profound transformation during the Gilded Age as universities adopted new models of research, teaching, and professional training. Before the Civil War, most American colleges resembled small seminaries focused heavily on classical studies, Latin, Greek, moral philosophy, and religious instruction. But between 1870 and 1900, new institutions emerged and older colleges reorganized themselves, embracing scientific inquiry and practical disciplines that reflected the demands of industrial society. The Moore Land-Grant Acts of 1862 and 1890 played a pivotal role by providing federal land for the establishment of universities dedicated to agriculture, engineering, and mechanical arts. These land-grant colleges, such as Cornell, the University of Illinois, Texas A&M, and many others, became engines of innovation, research, and public service. They helped modernize American farming through agricultural experiment stations, extension programs, and scientific instruction in soil management, crop rotation, and livestock care. As engineering fields expanded, universities trained the professionals who built the nation's railroads, bridges, factories, and electrical systems. The rise of research universities further accelerated intellectual change. Inspired by German models, institutions like Johns Hopkins emphasized graduate study, laboratory research, and academic specialization. Professors were increasingly viewed not merely as teachers, but as scholars expected to contribute new knowledge to their fields. This shift produced breakthroughs in medicine, chemistry, history, sociology, and the emerging social sciences. Universities created professional schools in law, medicine, business, and teaching, establishing standardized curricula that replaced earlier apprenticeship-based systems. Women also gained access to higher education in unprecedented numbers. Women's colleges, such as Wellesley, Bryn Mawr, Vassar, and Smith, became centers of academic excellence, offering rigorous instruction equal to that of elite men's institutions. Coeducational universities, particularly in the West, enrolled large numbers of women who pursued degrees in teaching, literature, science, and the arts. Although professional opportunities remained limited, these educational gains laid crucial groundwork for future movements toward gender equality. For African Americans, higher education was both a promise and a challenge. Institutions such as Howard University, Fisk University, Tuskegee Institute, and Hampton Institute became pillars of black intellectual life, though they operated in a deeply segregated society. The debate between industrial education, associated with Booker T. Washington, and classical liberal arts training, advocated by W.B. Du Bois, reflected tensions about how best to empower black Americans in a hostile nation. Despite financial hardship and societal racism, black colleges produced teachers, ministers, lawyers, activists, and scholars who profoundly shaped 20th century civil rights struggles. The transformation of higher education during the Gilded Age thus reflected both the ambitions and the contradictions of American society, expanding opportunities while still grappling with inequality and exclusion. Intellectual life during the Gilded Age flourished as Americans engaged with new ideas, new debates, and new forms of cultural expression. Universities, magazines, scientific societies, and lecture halls became arenas for discussing the pressing social, economic, and political questions of the age. The growth of public libraries democratized access to knowledge, enabling workers, immigrants, women, and children to read literature, study technical manuals, and explore scientific texts. Industrial tycoons like Andrew Carnegie funded hundreds of libraries across the United States, believing that free access to books was essential for self-improvement. These libraries became important community centers, offering lectures, reading clubs, and educational programs that expanded intellectual horizons. Newspapers and magazines played a central role in shaping public opinion. Publications such as Harper's Weekly, Century Magazine, and The Atlantic monthly published essays, fiction, political commentary, and investigative journalism that engaged readers in national debates. The rise of muckraking journalism exposed corruption, corporate abuses, unsafe working conditions, and urban poverty, holding political and economic elites accountable. Writers like Henry George sparked intense discussion with works such as Progress and Poverty, which examined the paradox of inequality amid economic growth and proposed radical solutions like land taxes. Edward Bellamy's utopian novel Looking Backward captured the imagination of millions by envisioning a future society without inequality or exploitation, inspiring political clubs and reform movements. Meanwhile, social science emerged as a new academic discipline. Scholars studied urban life, labor conditions, immigration, and criminal behavior using systematic data collection and analysis. This new way of understanding society influenced reformers, policymakers, and activists, providing tools to address the complexities of modern life. Philosophical debates also shaped intellectual life. Pragmatism, an American philosophical movement led by thinkers like William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, and John Dewey, rejected abstract theories in favor of practical problem solving. Pragmatism argued that truth should be measured by its usefulness and real-world outcomes, a perspective that resonated in an era obsessed with progress and innovation. Literature reflected the tensions and contradictions of the age as well. Realist and naturalist authors such as Mark Twain, Henry James, Kate Chopin, and Stephen Crane explored themes of human psychology, social inequality, moral ambiguity, and the pressures of industrial society. Their works challenged romanticized views of American life and offered sharper, more critical perspectives on human experience. Intellectual life in the Gilded Age was therefore deeply vibrant, a turbulent mix of scientific discovery, political critique, cultural experimentation, and philosophical inquiry. It revealed a nation wrestling with the consequences of rapid transformation while striving to understand its place in a rapidly changing world. The Gilded Age marked a major turning point in the development of American entertainment and leisure. As industrialization transformed work schedules, urban life created new possibilities for recreation, and technological innovations changed how people experience culture. The concept of mass culture, entertainment designed for large, diverse audiences, began to take shape during these decades, laying the groundwork for modern popular culture. For the first time in American history, millions of people had access to regular wages, fixed work hours, and weekends or evenings free from labor. even though many workers, especially the poor, still labored long and exhausting days. The structure of industrial work created predictable schedules that allowed for organized leisure. Cities, with their dense populations and bustling streets, became the centers of this emerging entertainment culture. Urban residents flocked to theaters, sporting events, parks, amusement halls, saloons, circuses, and dance halls in numbers never seen before. Immigration also played a role, bringing new traditions, foods, music, and performance styles that enriched American culture and expanded its audience appeal. The growth of leisure was inseparable from the rise of commercial entertainment businesses. Entrepreneurs recognized that entertainment could be highly profitable, and they invested heavily in building theaters, music halls, and public attractions. Advances in lighting, acoustics, and stage technology allowed for increasingly sophisticated performances. The invention of electric lighting, introduced to theaters in the 1880s, transformed nighttime entertainment, making venues brighter, safer, and more appealing than ever. Touring companies traveled across the country, bringing professional performances to towns large and small. Meanwhile, railroad networks made it easy for audiences to travel to regional entertainment hubs. Whether through variety shows, orchestral concerts, magic acts, or dramatic productions, entertainment became a national industry. The Gilded Age redefined what it meant to relax, enjoy life, and participate in a shared cultural experience. As America modernized, leisure became not a luxury, but an essential part of the social fabric. A reflection of a society constantly redefining itself. One of the most important developments in Gilded Age entertainment was the rise of vaudeville, a form of live performance that combined comedy, music, dance, acrobatics, magic, animal acts, and theatrical sketches into a single show. Vaudeville was designed for broad appeal, drawing from working-class traditions, immigrant cultures, and mainstream American humor to create an eclectic, fast-paced experience that captivated audiences. By the 1880s and 1890s, vaudeville theaters filled cities across the country, from major urban centers like New York and Chicago to smaller towns along railway routes. Unlike earlier forms of entertainment that catered to specific classes, vaudeville positioned itself as family-friendly and accessible to all. This broad appeal allowed performers from diverse backgrounds, Jewish comedians, Irish singers, Italian musicians, black dancers, and more, to gain national recognition. Vaudeville became a launching pad for performers who would later transition into radio, film, and television. Stars like Buster Keaton, W.C. Fields, Eddie Cantor, and the Marx Brothers began their careers on vaudeville stages. African American performers brought extraordinary talent to vaudeville, though they often faced discriminatory barriers and were forced to perform in segregated venues or stereotyped roles. Despite the limitations imposed by racism, black artists infused vaudeville with musical and comedic innovations that profoundly shaped American culture. Vaudeville was only one part of a broader entertainment boom. Traveling circuses, such as Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth, became national sensations, blending exotic animals, elaborate costumes, giant tents, and thrilling performances into spectacular events. These circuses brought entertainment to rural Americans who rarely had access to theaters or large public events. Meanwhile, amusement parks emerged as thrilling new destinations. Coney Island in New York became the most famous example, featuring roller coasters, electric rides, boardwalk games, and dazzling nighttime light displays. These parks represented a bold new vision of leisure, mechanical, energetic, and modern. They symbolized the excitement and anxiety of a society rushing toward the future. At the same time, the rise of spectator sports changed American culture dramatically. Baseball became a national pastime, drawing massive crowds and fostering local pride. Boxing, horse racing, and football also gained popularity, creating famous athletes who became early celebrities. Together, these developments marked the birth of American mass entertainment, a cultural revolution driven by technology, immigration, urbanization, and entrepreneurship. The Gilded Age also witnessed major changes in media, literature, and the ways Americans consumed information and entertainment. Newspapers transformed into powerful engines of mass communication, driven by technological innovations such as the rotary press and the telegraph. These tools allowed newspapers to print thousands of copies quickly and gather news from distant locations within hours. Publishers like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst revolutionized journalism with dramatic headlines, investigative reporting, sports coverage, human interest stories, political cartoons, and sensationalist yellow journalism. Their newspapers competed fiercely for readers, shaping public opinion and influencing political debates. The growing availability of cheap print materials allowed millions of Americans to read novels, magazines, and newspapers regularly. Publishing houses thrived, producing dime novels, cheap, exciting fiction that often depicted Western adventure, detective mysteries, or melodramatic romances. These stories catered especially to young readers and working-class Americans seeking affordable entertainment. Meanwhile, highbrow literature explored more complex themes. Writers like Henry James, Edith Wharton, Mark Twain, and Stephen Crane examined the moral dilemmas of modern society, offering critiques of wealth, corruption, class divisions, and the tensions between tradition and progress. Twain's The Gilded Age, co-written with Charles Dudley Warner, gave the era its famous nickname, capturing both its glittering facade and its underlying problems. Visual culture also expanded dramatically. Photography became more accessible thanks to technological innovations like the Kodak camera, allowing ordinary Americans to capture personal memories in ways never before possible. Magazines incorporated photographs into their pages, creating new forms of storytelling and journalism. Illustrators and cartoonists, such as Thomas Nast, used their art to shape political debates and expose corruption, proving that images could be as powerful as words. Music evolved as well. Parlor music, fueled by the widespread sale of pianos and sheet music, became a staple of middle-class homes. Brass bands, barbershop quartets, and traveling musicians introduced regional styles to national audiences. At the same time, African American musical traditions, blues, spirituals, ragtime, began influencing mainstream culture, laying the groundwork for jazz. Overall, the Gilded Age created a vibrant and diverse cultural landscape. Entertainment was no longer reserved for elites, but became a shared national experience that reflected the hopes, anxieties, and contradictions of a rapidly modernizing country. Mass culture emerged as one of the defining features of American identity, shaping how people interacted, what they valued, and how they imagined the future. The Gilded Age left an enormous imprint on the United States, shaping its economic structures, political institutions, cultural norms, and social tensions in ways that continue to influence the country today. The era's defining features: rapid industrialization, sprawling corporations, extreme wealth disparities, political corruption, urbanization, immigration, and cultural innovation, created the foundation for modern America. Many of the policies, conflicts, and advancements that emerged during this period set precedents that future generations would expand, challenge, or reinterpret. Economically, the Gilded Age established the basic blueprint of American capitalism. Large-scale corporate enterprise, national markets, technological innovation, and financial systems capable of mobilizing vast amounts of capital. The consolidation strategies pioneered by figures like Rockefeller and Carnegie, vertical integration, horizontal integration, and trusts, became models that corporations still use today. Even modern antitrust laws, labor protections, and government regulatory agencies trace their roots to Gilded Age controversies. Politically, the struggles over corruption, patronage, and the role of government in regulating business produced a lasting shift towards stronger federal intervention in the economy. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the Sherman Antitrust Act created the early framework for modern administrative governance. Culturally, the Gilded Age fostered new forms of mass entertainment, journalism, and intellectual debate that laid the groundwork for contemporary media and public discourse. Socially, it introduced conversations about inequality, immigration, racial justice, women's rights, and labor conditions that remained central to national life. The era's contradictions, opulence alongside poverty, progress alongside exploitation, innovation alongside injustice, captured the complexity of a nation in transition. These contradictions did not simply disappear at the turn of the century. They evolved into new forms and continued shaping American identity. Understanding the Gilded Age is therefore essential for understanding modern America, as the issues that define the period remain deeply relevant in debates over technology, corporate power, democracy, and social justice. Many historians and commentators draw direct parallels between the Gilded Age and the contemporary United States, often describing the present era as a second Gilded Age. These comparisons highlight how patterns of wealth concentration, technological disruption, political division, and cultural transformation echo those of the late 19th century. In both eras, technological innovation reshaped the economy at breathtaking speed. During the Gilded Age, railroads, telegraphs, and electricity revolutionized communication and commerce. Today, the digital revolution, driven by the internet, smartphones, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing, has similarly transformed how people work, communicate, learn, and create. The rise of massive tech corporations such as Amazon, Google, Meta, Apple, and Microsoft mirrors the rise of industrial giants like Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, and the railroad trusts. Both sets of corporations wield unprecedented economic and cultural influence, raising concerns about monopolistic behavior, data control, and political power. Wealth inequality is another striking parallel. Just as the Gilded Age produced tycoons with unimaginable fortunes, modern America has seen the rise of billionaires whose wealth rivals or surpasses that of 19th century industrialists. In both eras, the concentration of wealth among a small elite has sparked debates about fairness, taxation, labor rights, and the responsibilities of the wealthy toward society. Working-class Americans in both periods have faced instability, wage pressures, and challenges created by technological change. Immigrant labor played a crucial role in industrial growth during the Gilded Age, just as immigrant workers contribute significantly to today's economy despite facing political hostility and social discrimination. The political landscape offers even more parallels. Both eras have been marked by intense partisan conflict, concerns about corruption, distrust of political institutions, and debates over the proper role of government. In the Gilded Age, political machines dominated cities, corporations influenced legislation, and public confidence in democratic systems weakened. Today, growing concerns about corporate lobbying, social media manipulation, campaign finance, and political polarization reflect similar anxieties. Cultural conflicts also resemble those of the Gilded Age. Debates about immigration, national identity, race relations, gender roles, and moral values continue to divide Americans. The rapid pace of technological and social change fosters both excitement and fear, just as it did in the late 19th century. These parallels make the Gilded Age an especially important period for understanding modern challenges. It offers historical lessons about regulation, reform, innovation, resistance, and the possibilities for balancing economic growth with social justice. Despite the challenges and contradictions of the Gilded Age, the era also generated powerful movements for reform, justice, and democratic renewal, movements that laid the groundwork for progress in the 20th century. The activism of farmers, workers, women, African Americans, and social reformers demonstrated that even in an age of extreme inequality and political corruption, collective action could reshape the nation. The populist movement forced Americans to confront the consequences of corporate power and advocate for democratic reforms that eventually became mainstream. The labor movement, despite facing violent repression, secured better wages, safer working conditions, and the right to organize, rights that transformed the American workplace. Women's activism in education, labor, settlement houses, and suffrage paved the way for the 19th Amendment and the expansion of political rights. African American leaders, intellectuals, and community organizers laid the foundations for the civil rights struggles that would accelerate in the 20th century. These reform efforts show that the Gilded Age was not simply a period of greed and exploitation, but also one of remarkable courage, creativity, and determination. Today, the legacy of the Gilded Age reminds us that systemic problems, whether inequality, corruption, discrimination, or unchecked corporate power, can be confronted when people organize and demand change. The era teaches that societies undergoing rapid technological and economic transformation must adapt their political and social institutions to ensure fairness and stability. It also highlights the resilience of democratic ideals, which have survived periods of intense stress and emerged stronger through reform. Ultimately, the Gilded Age reveals the dual nature of American progress: innovation paired with inequality, opportunity paired with exclusion, and ambition paired with conflict. These tensions continue to define the United States, making the history of the Gilded Age not just a story of the past, but a mirror reflecting the challenges and possibilities of the present. By studying this transformative period, we gain insight into how modern America came to be and how it might evolve in the future. The lessons of the Gilded Age encourage us to imagine a society that harnesses innovation while ensuring justice, balances individual ambition with collective responsibility, and strives toward a future where prosperity is shared rather than hoarded. In this way, the legacy of the Gilded Age remains alive, offering both warnings and inspiration for the generations that follow. Thank you for staying with History Teller YT as we traveled through the vast and complicated world of the American Gilded Age. Today, you saw the rise of great fortunes and the cost paid by millions. You witnessed the struggles of workers, immigrants, women, African Americans, and farmers who refused to accept injustice and fought tirelessly for a better future. You explored how new technologies reshaped society, how corruption infected politics, and how bold reformers challenged the powerful in the name of fairness and democracy. The moral of this history is clear. A nation becomes strong not only through innovation, ambition, or wealth, but through the courage of ordinary people who stand up for justice, demand accountability, and fight for the dignity of every human being. Progress always brings challenges, but challenges also create opportunities for change. And just like the Gilded Age transformed America forever, today we are living through another moment of great transformation. Understanding this history gives us the tools to understand our present and shape a better future. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to come back to History Teller YT. More powerful stories, more untold history, more deep dives into the past are waiting for you here. Your curiosity is what keeps this channel alive, and your presence is always welcome. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the story of us all. This is History Teller YT.